Through tragedy, Issei awakened a power which places him as a predator, one of the most dominant beings on the planet. As the eighth, he must defend the planet from a force beyond his current means. Ideals clash, blood is shed, and hearts are broken in his struggle to protect those he loves most dear. But he can do it. He has become Diedrich Gok. Slight O, Op Issei, O sees inside. Chapter 1. The story thus far. A note from the author, revised 3 February 15. Hello everybody and thank you very much for taking the chance to read 8th, The Dragoon. I greatly appreciate it and hope you like it as well. A note before the story kicks off. Most of the notes in later chapters are a little out of date. Second, I've made a great deal of mistakes in this story. Like my math. I fully accept my math is terrible and I also regret not fully researching how Issei's sacred gear works. I've made corrections here and there but left some out in the open to remind myself of where I went wrong. I refuse to hide anything under the carpet. Another thing, as I'm told to mention by my peers, this story is something of a crossover between High School DxD and the series of original stories I work on. Expect to be confused every so often on the lore, but I assure you everything is explained at one point. Mostly. Now then, having all that said, I thank all of you for taking the time to read this story. Without further ado, on with the show. Lately, should one turn on the television and watch the nightly news station, particularly in relations to world events, it wasn't uncommon to have the broadcast give a report about the newest mystery. Within the past 3 years, terrible events have been prevented by the arrival of what could be best described as a red blur. Planes landed safely after failing due to sabotage or malfunctions. Invading forces in third world countries were halted no matter what side they were on or for what reason they had to fight in the first place, to even petty robberies, muggings, attempted kidnapping and raping was stopped with the criminals being found bound in front of police stations. Every one of the involved would report a red blur appearing out of nowhere and then disappearing as soon as it arrived. Never a life was lost when it was around. At first, this was just assumed to be some sort of childish speculation as several theories and mythological lore swept through the internet. It wasn't until a year ago did the news media start to take it seriously. There was a fragment of a second when this red blur had paused. And in that fragment of a second had a group of teenage tourists been conveniently taking a picture of their surroundings to record their memories. And minutes later one of them would be calling the local authorities after having heard gunshots. It would later turn out to have been a lair of drug smugglers who had their base thrashed, and each one of the criminals would report to having seen a red blur moving far too fast for any of them to see clearly. Though still so far away, the image of a red humanoid with a tail and fluorescent wings was captured right before its raid began. The world was set ablaze by the surfacing of this evidence. No one knew what it was. No one could trace its movements as it continued to sweep across the world. In one moment it would be stopping pirates from the Atlantic and in less than an hour it would be rescuing people from a storm in the Americas. The speed of its travel was truly unfathomable. Many speculated there was multiples of this phenomenon. Governments had denied knowing of its origin just as much as they had attempted to capture this unknown creature. Some even went as far as creating their own disasters in hopes of luring it into a trap. The creature had either adapted or grew cunning as now whenever it arrived, technology started to fail in its presence. Capturing any further pictures, let alone the creature itself, was deemed impossible. But the photograph was the only evidence that would ever surface. Without any further leads, the people eventually began to lose interest. But that is not to say they weren't still curious about this. Simply until new information could surface, there wasn't anything they could do about it. That is until the appearance of a white blur appeared. Now, just as the red creature was treated as some childish myth until the picture arrived, there were rumors on the internet about other colored creatures roaming around the world, including that of a white one. There were even people across the world who reported seeing blurs of various hues during events of carnage, but of course none of this was true. Yet a camera crew from Germany had been able to capture the image of a white being just after a roaring forest fire had been contained. It had been floating high above the air, higher than their helicopter could reach, higher than most flying vehicles could. It was but a speck in the distance and impossible to notice. The only reason why they had noticed it was because of the howl of rage it had unleashed. Its roar had been heard within a several-mile radius. Their cameras had been able to see the speck for but an instant before its fluorescent wings took it away due east. The local villagers would later report something large and red had stopped the fire from advancing to their area before taking to the skies. Once more the world was swept off their feet by the appearance of a second winged figure. And once more the cycle of trying to locate these two beings took off, but granting no results. However, the world had come to a conclusion as a pattern was starting to gather. When a disaster struck, the red one would appear. And as soon as it was concluded and the red one would leave, the white one would appear as though searching for it. Alas, there wasn't a definite pattern as there was always something going on around the world. At times the white one would be the first to appear as though waiting for the red one. Yet never were they seen together. It was also speculated the white one was slower than the red. It would take hours for the white being to travel throughout countries while it took a fraction of that time for the red one to travel around the world. Their wings were also different. While the white could be described by witnesses to have wings akin to green mist, or green sparkling dust, the red was far more radiant. Its wings never had the same description as witnesses would claim its wings were one color or the other. Even the lone photograph of its appearance a year ago produced different colors depending on who was looking at it. It was but another marvel that could not be explained. The shape was an entirely different discussion. Nevertheless, once more the world was left alone in the darkness as these beings were beyond their reach. Governments still attempted traps here and there, creating high tensions amongst other nations as well as their own people. The red one would be seen but could not be identified, and the white one would be close behind. Close, but yet so far away. Some began to question if the white one was looking for the red, why not just cause a disaster of its own to lure the red? Scene, please go out with me. Hyodo Issei was anything but a normal high school student. On the surface he might be, but after a few years of seeing the worst the world had to offer, most of his innocence hadn't been scrubbed away as much as it had been wrenched from his soul. He still attended school, still did his homework, still did a few odd jobs here and there to make ends meet, and still ogled, peeped, girls at every chance. He was quite average looking. He wasn't handsome, but he wasn't hideous either. Most would say he was boring to look at. Which was good because of his hobby hardly anyone gave him a second glance, unless he got caught of course. Though he was far more fit than a normal high school student should be. The way he wore his uniform over a long-sleeve undershirt left him looking like a scrawny weakling. Whenever he changed for physical education he kept on the undershirt so no one would see the series of muscles underneath. Or what lay on his back. Issei would have to say he did everything he could within his power to avoid attention like the plague. And it was working so far. It also wasn't that hard to do. Why, even Roland Senpai encouraged it when the shrimp suggested he should continue being a pervert, to the extreme no less. Perverts never get much recognition other than to be despised by everyone around them. They were rejected by society most of the time and quite shunned. So, other than his fellow perverts Matsuda and Motohama, no one ever gave him the bit of time to get to know him. It was a sad and lonely life, but he at least had the company of his 7 senpai if he ever asked. But he didn't because they all scared the living shit out of him, especially the Divine Beast and the Dragon Slayer, the former hating him for being a pervert while the latter was his natural enemy. So, Issei was at first confused as all hell when this girl approached him on his way home and asked him out. She was very cute, no doubt a highly popular girl with the boys at her school. However, Issei couldn't trace a hint of honesty coming from her. "I think you have the wrong guy," Issei sighed. This wouldn't be the first time a girl had asked him out. And not once had they done so because they wanted to. Always they had done so because they lost some bet or this was some rite of passage. He was known as the ultimate test. Such was the fate of a super pervert like him. "Hyodo Issei-kun, a second year at Kuo Academy," the girl responded. She blushed, bowed her head, and fiddled with her hands. "My name is Amano Yuma. And I've been wanting to meet you for some time. But if you don't want to." There it was again, that trace of insincerity. Her words weren't forced, but they weren't natural either. Without a reason of a doubt she was deceiving him. Okay. But Issei was a pervert before he was anything else. So what if this girl was going to go on a date with him with impure motives? He was a huge sucker for cute girls and this performance was the best one so far with the way she was behaving and expertly putting on a blush. He felt weak in the knees with how kawaii she was behaving. Really? The girl looked up with hope in her eyes. Issei nodded vigorously. He was so excited steam was about to shoot from his nostrils. Yuma gave a lovely smile as she said, "Then please meet me at the shopping center tomorrow at noon." With that, she turned and fled in haste with a large blush covering her face. And Issei shot a fist into the air in triumph as though he had achieved the unachievable, despite it being given to him. However, when he turned away to continue onward home, he did not miss the presence of murderous intent coming from the girl. As one who had been surrounded by it constantly throughout his exhibitions, he hadn't grown numb to it but had been able to acknowledge and shrug it off. Killing intent wasn't some actual presence often expressed in anime. It was a concept in which can only be assumed by the intended like any other emotion. Love, hate, joy, sorrow. These such things had to be recognized by reading body language and nothing else. Killing intent wasn't something that floated in the air and struck him like an arrow. Yet, because of what he was, Issei had been able to sense what his favorite anime heroes could. This girl, without a doubt, was planning his death. The smart thing to do would be to avoid her from here on out. Some of his senpai would strike her down now just to avoid any future problems. But, again, Issei was a pervert before he was one of them. He was going to spend as much time with the super cute girl as he could. He might even get the chance to take the first step into achieving his ultimate goal. To build a harem. Seeing their day was fantastic. They were much like any other couple. They saw a romantic comedy film, had lunch as a local cafe, and spent the remainder of the afternoon playing games at the arcade. He managed to win her a trinket from one of the crane machines, after spending a large chunk of his cash in many failed attempts. But her smile was worth it, even if it was fake. Throughout the day, he knew he was being watched. He pretended to not notice it as he continued playing with Yuma, which wasn't all that hard to do as he was too busy staring at her chest. She noticed a few times, blushed, but said nothing as though she was giving him permission. As it was getting late with the sun beginning to set, they took a silent stroll through the park. No one was around at this hour. Yuma even wrapped her arms around his, pressing her right breast against him. Normally the chance to get closer should have sent warning signals through him. He was too busy trying to keep his downstairs roommate from getting excited. They reached the center of the park, which contained a large fountain with a few benches circling around it. It was a romantic sight as the sun leaked through the trees and created sparkles over the water. No one else was around and it would have been the perfect chance to receive a kiss. Yuma released him and skipped over to the fountain. She twirled, put her hands behind her back, and bent over slightly for him to catch a small glimpse of her cleavage. Aiz-kun, today was so much fun. Now there's just one more thing left to do. Can I ask you for a favor? Issei gulped as all of his attention was drawn towards her bountiful chest. The words as well as her growing murderous intent completely flew over his head. Yuma giggled as she drew closer to him. So close in fact she was able to cup one hand to his cheek. The smile she gave was truly radiant. "Can you die for me?" Issei blinked, snapping out of his daze. She took a step back. Black wings sprouted out of her back and such a snap feathers fluttered everywhere. Gone was the persona of a cute love-struck girl, only to be replaced by a malevolent, if not amused, killer. This was nice. Even her tone had changed to that of something far more mature. It was like playing house with a child. The air vibrated as she extended a hand to her right. The shadows within the park seemed to darken as though all the light was drawn directly into her hand. And as if so, light manifested into solid form in the figure of a spear. Her hands clenched around it as though it truly were a physical weapon. Faster than a human could have moved, she went through the proper stance and performance of throwing the spear a master would have. The spear of light traveled as fast as a bullet. At this close of a distance, she could have just taken a step forward and stabbed him with it. Instead, she had been arrogant and thought to fling it at him, expecting him to die immediately. He saw her eyes widened as the dragon blood coursed through his veins, changing his eyes into golden serpentine spheres. He twisted his body while assuming a stance of his own. The sphere of light phased by him, if not scorching his polo. Wah! Yuma gasped in shock at the speed he had been able to move, before being cut off by him closing in on her and delivering a powerful punch to her abdomen. Issei wasn't sure what she was. While he wasn't unfamiliar to the supernatural, he was still raised as a mundane child. It wasn't until his most recent exploits did he come across the likes of monsters. This was one of the few rare humanoid beings he had come across and their durability ranged. Thus, he wasn't sure how much an attack was too much and too little. He decided to give his first strike with enough force to knock a bulky human unconscious. Yuma had a lot of resistance as the blow did nothing but startle her. However, now he had a good guess on how much damage she could take. This time he held nothing back. Before she could recover, he sent his other fist ramming below her jaw. She went spinning to his right, but caught herself in a backhand spring, flipping once, and then regaining her footing. Such a blow should have left her unconscious. All it left her was a slight bruise and a bleeding lip as the shock of the blow forced her to bite. She wiped away the blood and snarled, "How the hell did a human?" He didn't give her the chance to talk. He kicked off the ground at her, once more catching her by surprise. With the assaulter stance, he dug his feet into the ground, brought the weight of his body around, and delivered a corkscrew haymaker. He heard something crunch as his fist met her left cheek, but his eyes narrowed as her inhuman durability once again left her conscious. All it did was make her stumble back. Yuma grunted in frustration and this time flew up with her large wings. She didn't need to flap to suspend herself. Issei wondered for a moment if it was a property of her species or if she had some sort of supernatural ability. "Don't screw with me," she cried, formed a spear of light in both her hands, and flung one after the other. Issei clicked his tongue and moved to dodge, but as soon as the first spear struck the ground, his senses screamed at him. When the spears made contact with the ground, they exploded. Debris flew everywhere fierce enough to damage the nearby fountain as well as tear apart a few of the benches. A pair of craters overlapping another about 3 meters in diameter was left. Yuma clicked her tongue in further frustration. Issei had been able to double his speed at the last instant as though he was holding back from the beginning. He barely managed to avoid the critical damage, but not in enough time to avoid the blunt force of the impact. He had stumbled a few times and expertly rolled back onto his feet. His clothes were in tatters. The faint glow of something etched onto his back was peeking through the holes of his undershirt. Yuma snarled but threw more spears of light his way. She gasped when his speed jumped even further. Somehow, in some way, he had been able to move far away from the blast zone. He crossed the distance of 20 meters in the blink of an eye. Even with magic, humans shouldn't be able to perform such feats. The human body had limits and the performance should have burdened his body to the point of snapping in two. Yet Issei was unfazed. There wasn't a sign of fatigue on him. His eyes were glowing as his stare sharpened. They weren't the eyes of a human. True, a human's eyes weren't gold with their irises being diamond shape akin to that of a serpent. She was referring to the way he was looking at her that wasn't human. Oh, he recognized her as one person to another. There was just something more, primal in that stare. Like a beast defending its territory from an invader. Issei moved again, crossing the destroyed field and without moving in a straight line to confuse Yuma. She wouldn't be able to get a direct hit on him by the way he was flickering from one place to another. All she could figure was that he was growing closer to her. So, she decided to fly up higher and generate a more potent spear of light, one big enough to level the terrain and sweep him away. Explosion. She didn't expect him to jump. The ground under him crumbled as his draconian strength sent him rocketing towards her. He saw she was trying to make a larger weapon and thus would require more time to prepare. It was from that window of opportunity did he react. His body ascended the heights at an alarming speed, catching her by surprise once again. She was helpless as she fumbled with the incomplete spear. He spun once in the air and brought an axis kick with his heel to her chest. Something definitely cracked as a loud thud from the impact could have been heard. The winged supernatural being was brought back down to the ground with enough force to create a crater from her crash. Even if she didn't lose consciousness, it'll take plenty of time for her to recover. More than enough time for him to safely descend and prepare for any further ploys. His senses flared as danger spiked towards his back. It was at the precise time in which he was still regaining his control from delivering the blow to Yuma. He had completely forgotten the presence watching him from earlier. He made a foolish mistake of ignoring it until they presented themselves. And so they had, and it would be critical. A spear of light pierced through his sides as he tried to spin to dodge. He wasn't quick enough after his body had reset itself, bringing him down to his natural limits. Regardless if he had been able to avoid damage to his heart and lungs, there was still the gaping hole on his waist. He cried out in pain as the descent was having his blood trail after him. The crash was anything but pleasant. It made his wound flare up in pain. Not that it would matter as his carelessness had gotten him killed. He was losing too much blood way too fast. He'd be lucky if he could make it for 3 minutes. Yuma slowly rose from the ground, grunting in pain and holding her right shoulder. Her right arm was dangling uselessly. She was having difficulty breathing and coughing up blood. It was probably from her inhuman durability she was able to stand. A normal person would have been dead from having their lungs caved in. "Looks like you were having trouble, Rainier," a man's voice said. Another winged being, in a black cloak and pointed hat, landed softly on the ground. He smirked in amusement at the sight of his wounded counterpart. Nasik, wheezed Yuma, or rather, Rainier. She tried to say more, but ended up in a coughing fit. As though knowing what she was going to say, Donasik shrugged with lax care. "You'd be dead if I didn't intervene. Not that I really care about you personally, but I think our little group would be disbanded without you. Azazel-sama would question your disappearance. We can't have him looking into our affairs." Issei tried to move. All of his instincts were telling him to live. He was going to die if he didn't stop the bleeding. He was going to die if he stayed here. These things were going to kill him. He winced in pain. He was cursing himself so much. These two weren't the greatest threat he had ever faced. Yet it was because they weren't as powerful he didn't take them as seriously. His senpai always told him to never underestimate an enemy. His instincts had told him there was danger potent enough to end his life. Yet he treated it like nothing. It was the most foolish mistake he ever made, and one that was going to cost him his life. The world was getting dark as his thoughts were starting to lose cognition. The feeling of pain could no longer keep him awake as it was gradually dying down. No, he was dying, that's what it was. His body was beginning to shut down, draconian nature or not. If it bleeds, it can die. But he wouldn't live that much longer anyways. Rainier brought a spear of light into his chest, piercing his heart. A sickening glare of pure hatred was locked on her once beautiful face. Her breathing was less labored, but her voice was still hoarse. "Don't blame me for this," she said. "Blame God for giving you a sacred gear." Before the spear dissipated, Issei's world became dark. He couldn't find the meaning behind her words. Not that it mattered at this point. He was dead. Scene asterisk. As soon as the sun rose over the horizon and touched his window, Issei was snapped at attention with enough clarity as though he had been shocked with an electric current through his spine. His body was registering potential harm, and that's what made him fully awake. But as he looked around his room, he didn't see anything that would bring him into immediate danger. He didn't get the feeling something was going to suddenly strike from a great distance either. Rather, as he focused on the feeling, the harm was already being done onto him. His instincts were telling him to go towards the shadows, away from the light. For what reason he couldn't understand, the sun itself was weakening him. It wasn't burning his skin or anything of the like, just draining him at a barely noticeable pace. Not necessarily a poison, but, like a decent weight, he supposed. He scratched his head in confusion, and from his fingers going against a certain section of his cranium did pain spike at his temple. God! He had the worst headache ever. Just what the hell was he doing last night? It felt like he got hit with another tank shell. When he tried to recall what happened last night, he couldn't remember. He remembered going on a date with Yuma, and that's it. He didn't even remember how he came home last night. Whatever. He could just send her an email or something, or ask one of his friends. No doubt his fellow perverts would have asked, threatened, for details as soon as the date was over. He must have contacted them to rub it in their faces. Since he was awake with no chance of going back to sleep, he might as well get up and start his regular routine. Plus it was a Sunday. He didn't have school and he had the whole day to fill out his responsibilities. Not that he would have slept in anyways. It's been 3 years since he's had the feeling to sleep more than 4 hours. He was just glad the nightmares stopped a year ago. In nothing but his boxers and his usual long sleeve, he went downstairs. And as usual, as it has been for 3 long years, everything was quiet. Though he no longer had the nightmares, he still had the phantasmal memories of his parents sitting together in the kitchen. His mother would be preparing breakfast, yelling at him to wake up, and his father would be reading the paper while drinking some coffee. To this day he could hear the clatter of their movements. Perhaps he was forcing himself to remember their habitual noises. It was more like a mental trigger at this point whenever he climbed the last step. And it was always disappointing to turn around the corner and find himself alone. Before going into the kitchen to prepare breakfast, he turned on the television to the usual setting, the one that would display 6 different channels at once. all of which were news channels. One was local, 2 were morning talk shows, and the other 3 were the stations that talked about the country as a whole as well as foreign affairs. Last, he flipped open the laptop placed on the counter. There were a large number of reports and messages to go over. At breakfast, he paid attention to the news broadcasts while skimming through his notifications. A lot of the messages were from his senpai, particularly from Philip's senpai and Roland's senpai. Phillips let him know of potential threats that might happen while Roland gave him the list of job requests the mercenary could have accepted. The rest were events that he couldn't fix with his powers alone. But there were a few things he could do. After cleaning the kitchen, showering, and dressing himself in his padded underclothes, he made way for the basement. There hadn't been one while his parents were still around, but thanks to Archibald Senpai it had been built and dated to have always existed in official records. Issei wasn't sure how the man had been able to manipulate the physical blueprints of the house with the papers being aged in exact date as their originals, but that was just the man's power. Should anyone visit, if ever, they will find the basement to be just a usual concrete space to store things. There were a lot of trinkets such as photo albums, clothes, and toys from his childhood. The majority of things were his parents'. However, once Issei walked under the wooden staircase and pushed open the secret door, it took him to a deeper part under his house. After following the usual path, he found his destination. It was a large open lot of pure darkness. Not a trace of light leaked through as it was sealed in concrete, layered in lead, and buried so deep it even went under the subway and sewage. But Issei didn't need to see when and hear. His other senses let him see the void of the area. It was only used as a tunnel to get him out of the city without being spotted. Balance breaker. Seen once more, he awoke before his alarm could go off. That was twice the rising of the sun had triggered his survival instincts. He didn't know what to make of it. He never had this problem before. And it's not like he could ask anyone about this. Going to a hospital was immediately out of the question. Imagine everyone's surprise when they examine him to find out he wasn't completely human anymore. As tempting as it was to curb that 3-year-long curiosity about what his insides were like, he didn't want anyone else to know. Especially if they decided to take a blood sample. He wondered if he should ask one of his senpai for help. Maybe the Dragon Slayer would be able to give him an appropriate diagnosis. But then again, he's already asked them for much and didn't want to burden them any further. They had their own problems. Besides, nothing screamed at him to run as far away as possible louder than when being in the same room as Siegfried senpai. Unless something serious came up, like he was puking blood or on his deathbed, he wasn't going to chance being alone with the Dragon Slayer. He turned off his alarm before it could go off and hopped in the shower. He was so tired last night he had forgotten to record any of the news stations to see if anyone else reported another sighting of the red blur. And if there was a sighting of the red, there was assured to be the white one close behind. So many times he was tempted to stick around to see who the other one who had similar powers was. But their meeting might stir up trouble. It was one thing that the world was aware of his existence. It would be another if he gave them the chance to know what he could and couldn't do. And then there was the white one. Who was he? What was he? Was it even a he? Why did the white one always follow him? These were the things that haunted his mind to the point where he was ready to snap. He was so damn curious, so many times he wanted to say the hell with caution and just meet. Imagine if it was a smoking hot babe under all that white armor. And she followed him because they were destined to be partners. He wished. He didn't get that sort of vibe when watching the German footage. His primal instincts had told him the white one was challenging him. Still didn't stop him from imagining if it was a hot babe. Scene. Hey guys. Issei asked his friends as soon as school was over. He would have asked them sooner if that blazing sun didn't give him such a headache. His fellow perverts were going on about what eroge they beat this weekend, but Issei had difficulty following them. He had difficulty during class more than usual for that matter. He wasn't that great with school to begin with, but seriously. Do you happen to know what happened Saturday night? His friends looked at him strangely. Saturday? Why? Were we supposed to meet up somewhere or something? Asked Matsuda. Issei raised a brow. Huh? Didn't I tell you I had a date? Silence. And then the two began laughing hysterically. I'm serious. Issei defended his pride as a man. Yeah, so he was a pervert who was hated by every single girl within the entire school, potentially the whole city. But he had managed to score. Granted, the girl was more than likely to have been forced to date him from some penalty game from her friends. But they went on a date regardless, damn it. Motohama fixed his glasses and smirked. Please Issei-kun, the chances of you getting a girlfriend are equally just as absent as ours. That's right, boasted Matsuda with pride. For whatever reason, the three of us are at the bottom of the tier. Besides, if you did get a girlfriend, we'd have to bring you back down to our level. Issei's sweat dropped. Yeah, his friends had threatened him when he had told them about Yuma with the same thing. So he planned on proving he went on a date by taking a picture with her with his cell phone. Oh wait. The picture. That's right. Only when Issei scanned through his phone he couldn't find it. He was sure the phone captured them together at the cafe. But as he was looking for more proof of her existing, he found that her email address was no longer registered in his contacts. Grimacing at this, he decided to dial the phone number he had memorized. He had stared at it the day before it had practically branded itself into his skull. As expected, the number was not in service. He didn't imagine having a date, did he? Well, whatever, Matsuda waved it off. Say, why don't we all go back to my place and watch my secret collection? That's an excellent idea. Motohama gave a lecherous smirk. Matsuda-kun, you should invite Issei-kun. It might do well since he hasn't been himself all day. Issei shrugged. Naturally they would have noticed he wasn't himself when he turned down their offer to peek on the girls' locker room for the umpteenth time at lunch. Of course I'm going to invite him, Motohama-kun. We are high school boys who move with sexual desires. If we don't do anything perverted, it would be disrespectful to our parents who gave birth to. Silence. Issei-kun, his bald friend realized what he had said. That is. However, Issei put a firm hand on his friend's shoulder and looked with fierce determination. Okay then, today, we won't hold back. We'll get some soda and chips while watching porn movies. His outburst was heard by everyone within the vicinity. By this point in their high school career, everyone had learned to expect this sort of deal from the three. However, there will never be a day when they could grow comfortable with them. After all, who would want to be okay with a group of young men with the highest potential in the entire world and becoming sexual assaulters? His words also sliced the tension between their group better than his claws through mundane steel. Oh, yeah, that's it. That's definitely the eyes we know. That's the spirit. We need to enjoy our youth even more. Matsuda and Motohama responded respectively to his declaration. Issei smiled. The hell with if he did or didn't go on a date. Besides, someone as cute and perfect as Yuma couldn't have existed in the first place. Though it broke his heart, he had to come to terms with the realization that no girl would actually date him. Even those who were forced to as a penalty game couldn't last more than an hour and showed their obvious disgust. And if that was the case, then he'd rather look at hentai and use his mind's eye to swap himself with the main protagonist. Nah, who was he kidding? He was crying on the inside. Why couldn't Yuma be real? Kya. One of the girls in the class squealed in delight. It's Rias Gremory. Within a blink of an eye, everyone dropped what they were doing and crammed themselves to the windows, including the three perverts. Who didn't know about the Rias Gremory? She was the #1 most popular girl among all of Kuo Academy, by both boys and girls. She was of English descent who chose to attend a Japanese school due to the business involvements of her father. It was obvious too. She had fair skin, the most dazzling blue eyes, an hourglass figure with the greatest of breasts, and flowing crimson hair. The same shade as blood. Issei's hand went over to his waist where he felt the remnants of a pain that wasn't there. There was a flash of something within his mind. Sure, he had seen Rias a few times before, but it felt like he had seen her before, if that could make sense. Crimson hair, crimson blood. Why did his chest and side ache so much? The strangest thing happened. Of the many times he was within range of Rias Gremory, she always continued with her pace as though she couldn't be bothered by anyone else. Not out of arrogance, but rather like a queen who her people would shun should she suddenly start talking to commoners. That, and the Rias fan club would murder the lone individual she talked to. The strange thing that happened was Rias had broken out of this norm. Her eyes snapped up to his and she gave the lightest and lovely of smiles. Normally, Issei wouldn't believe for a second she was looking at him. However, something within him stirred and he knew she was looking at him. How that smile was just for him. It was a primal feeling he was unfamiliar with. Love? No, something more definite. Something that was making him aware of her presence, of her beauty, of her feelings. How she was suddenly his whole world. Issei, being a pervert and all, would have been like this by default. But when there was a force telling him otherwise, he naturally had to take a step back. The feeling was subservience, he realized. Rias Gremory wasn't giving him a smile of arrogance, believing she was a greater being above him like every other woman did. She was presenting an authority that said so. Like he was wearing a collar and she holding the leash. It pissed him off. S&M he was okay with. But this? There was nothing perverted about it. This was a girl who had, somehow, claimed every fiber of his being for herself. This wasn't natural. His draconian nature couldn't allow it. His title as eighth couldn't allow someone to be above him. Rias saw his displeasure. Her smile faltered as her brows scrunched up in slight confusion. No matter what expression she had, it was absolutely breathtaking anyways. The girls squealed and the boys cheered. Oi, Issei-kun, you alright? Issei blinked as soon as Rias was out of his sight. He didn't know what that was about. Whatever it was left him clenching his left side. His face felt stiff. He wondered how long he was glaring at her. Yeah, I'm alright. He released his grip and flexed his fingers. His hand was a little stiff. Actually, I'm not feeling so well today. I think I'm going to just head home for today. His friends gawked in unison. The glasses-wearing Motohama said, do you have some kind of illness? No, it can't be. There is no way that you, the manifestation of all sexual desires, would fall sick. Issei tried to smile at that. Tried. There were some things that came out of Motohama's mouth that really hurt. It might have been something I ate. I'll join you guys next time. Scene home was forever a depressing place to be. There was no one to return to other than his own isolation. It also wasn't the day to travel the world. In order to avoid being traced back to Japan, Issei had come up with a randomly generated schedule of when he was to go out saving people. The red blur couldn't be saving people during only the time when most Japanese schools didn't hold classes. People would get suspicious. And so, there were days when he had to skip classes to go out. He also had to stretch out and even his schedule so that it wouldn't harm his grades. As much as he hated doing so, he had to make time to study and homework. Regardless, going home was something he wanted to avoid at the moment. But he also didn't have anything to do. Perhaps he should have gone with his friends to watch porn. It sure as hell would have been much better than brooding around the city. Well, with nothing else to do, he decided to just wander. Maybe he'll catch some crooks trying to have their way with some girl. Only for him to swoop in and save the day. And receive a reward from the damsel? Sounds like a plan. As the sun began to set with his hours of wandering going to waste, there wasn't so much as a girl to save as there was crime to stop to begin with in the whole freaking city. He began to notice some things. The dragon blood had enhanced his senses above human standards. But he had them for 3 years and so had grown accustomed to them. However, as it began to get darker and darker, he noticed his senses were being enhanced further. He could see within the darkness when there was no light, could hear the conversations of people from as far as his eyes could see, and his scent of smell could pick up, recognize, and sort the various stenches of the city. Luckily he could also block them off. Like hell he wanted to smell the sewage under the sidewalk. He didn't know what was going on or why. He couldn't even come up with a theory. Clearly something had happened to him at some point. His body hadn't gone through such a metamorphosis since 3 years ago. However, nothing came to mind within the past few days. But then again, there was that large chunk of memory he couldn't recall from Saturday night. Despite what his friends might say, he remembers that date. But at some point the memories cut off. The last thing he remembered was walking side by side through the park. Well, this is rare. Issei knew that voice. Or at least he thought he did. The sound and tone rang a chime through his head, but he couldn't recognize the owner. Issei had come to the park, not really expecting anything but rather hoping to find some clues as to what happened a few days ago. His head was aching a little as he could pick up a few flash images here and there. He saw light, black feathers, the sound of explosions, and then there was the feeling of being stabbed in the chest. From his experience, he could at least piece together there was some kind of fight he was involved in. But he couldn't make sense of it, especially about the part on how he came home unscathed in the first place. The area was immaculate as it had always been, but that was irrelevant as he knew there were forces and organizations that specialized in covering the damages caused by supernatural beings. He did wish he was one of those beings who could find out who was responsible for cleaning the area, however. When he turned away from the fountain, the appearance of a tall man in a dark suit and fedora was approaching him. Not only was his voice familiar but as well as his appearance. "I didn't expect you to be revived as a devil," he went on. "Who is your master?" The image of Rias Gremory flashed through his mind at the word, master, almost out of instinct. He responded, "I have no master." Although, he had no idea what it meant. "I see," nodded the man. "Black wings sprouted from his back. Then that would make you a stray. So it wouldn't be a problem if I kill you." He extended his right hand. The shadows of the area grew as light was being absorbed into his hand. It manifested into solid form, taking the shape of a spade-bladed spear. Wings and a spear of light, the memories were starting to come together. Hey, wait a minute. Issei shot his hands up and waved frantically. He took several steps back to gain as much distance as possible, not before doubling his potential just in case. What the hell is that? Hey, are those wings? What is going on? Here, take my money. Just don't hurt me. He knew he had fought something like this before. The phantom pain to his side and heart confirmed that. He needed to take him on seriously, else screw up like last time. However, last time ended up, but still, and in order to do that, he needed time. The more time he wasted, the higher his potential could be doubled. To show he was serious, Issei even pulled out his wallet, dropped it to his feet, and took several steps away. The man frowned. How strange. Though it is not uncommon for the dead to suffer memory loss, you don't expect to fool me with that charade, do you? I've seen what you can do. Issei frowned. Well, that sucks. But the strategy wasn't hopeless yet. He fell to his hands and knees and bowed. Please don't kill me. I haven't achieved my goal of obtaining a harem yet. That right there consumed 10 seconds of silence. The winged man didn't know how to properly respond. He opened his mouth and then shut it. You can't be serious. Of course I am. Issei burst with passion. What man wouldn't want to have a harem? To fall asleep every night with pillows of breasts. It's what I live for. Again, the man paused. He sighed. You base creatures are so simple-minded. Devil or not, you were once human. Of course your desires would be so primitive. And I don't doubt those desires are stronger than ever because you're now a devil. Issei laughed nervously as has scratched his head. So does this mean you'll let me go? No. Oh, well, could I make one last request then? I'm not going to find you a woman or anything of the sort. No, not that. He waved it off, but began to drool. It would have been nice though. Spending the last night alive on this world with a beautiful. Out with it. The winged being was growing impatient. Issei was actually surprised he was willing to listen. Ah. Well, could you tell me what this is about? Seems like a waste and all, not knowing why I'm about to die. The man's eyes narrowed in contemplation, taking up more time in the process. Very well. I see no point in telling you since you're about to die. We simply see you as a potential threat because of what you contain within you. We're not sure what sacred gear you contain, but if it has Azazel-sama's interest, then it means it is something of high potential. We can't afford to have you awakening its power, and so we decided to eliminate you before you become a threat. It's nothing personal. The memories were beginning to come together. Yuma was also a winged being who could throw violet spears of light. Yuma wasn't her name either. What was it? Then can I have the name of the one who is about to kill me? Donasek, the supernatural being replied while raising his spear up. Now enough. One last thing. What? This time, Issei smiled. Explosion. Recognition surfaced from Donasek's face as his eyes widened. He must have seen this technique before. But it was too late. Issei had been able to drag out 2 minutes. A total of 140 seconds of idle conversation. And if he could double his base potential every 10 seconds, he had doubled them 14 times. Imagine a weakling only able to lift 50 pounds. If his abilities are doubled, then he could lift up to 100 pounds. If this is done 14 times, then he will be able to lift 700 pounds. Except Issei was far from being weak. His body was enhanced by draconian blood, in which he had 3 years for his body to finish adapting to. He was far more durable than any average human being. Hell, he was probably stronger than the strongest man alive. His limits went above and beyond the norm of a human's. And this freakish power was multiplied 14 times. Thunder struck loud enough to make anyone nearby rupture their eardrums by the sound of impact coming from Issei's fist to Donasek's face. There never was a chance for the winged being to react in time. It was simply impossible. Sure, he moved, he tried to do something, but Issei couldn't tell whether it was to defend or attack. It was but an instant when Issei crossed the distance and delivered his strike. Danasik was sent flying, breaking through benches and trees alike as though they were made of paper. Issei gave a sigh of relief as his body reset to its natural standard. The memories finally came back and set into his mind. He had forgotten them due to damage from the blood loss. At least he had been able to get them back, let alone being fully functional and not some kind of spud, being revived or not be damned. It would suck if he couldn't feel anything downstairs. But it didn't answer how he had been able to get home. He remembered Danazik's surprise attack and then Rainier delivering the final blow. But that's it. Perhaps, what happened afterwards transpired outside his consciousness. How? Issei grimaced. It hadn't been his aim to kill him, but seriously. The guy took the blunt force of a truck going as fast as a bullet. Yet, Danasik was making his way back to the fountain. That wasn't to say he was unscathed. His nose was clearly broken and leaking blood and his left eye was completely shut. His clothes were in tatters with a few splinters sticking out of his limbs. He gritted his teeth and continued, "How dare a low species like you do this to me? I'll not forgive you for this. I'm going to torture you until you beg for mercy." The mood had shifted. Danazik's killing intent spiked. But as he had grown serious, so too had Issei. He underestimated his opponent once and it cost him his life. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Balance. A bright crimson glow erupted between them. Danasik growled in frustration while Issei had to shield his eyes from the light. But he recognized the markings of a magic circle etching themselves into the ground. He couldn't tell what sort of spell was being cast, nor could he sense the origin of the caster. Just in case, he took several leaps back. It never was a hostile spell. It was a summoning circle. When the lights died down, the presence of a crimson-haired beauty stood between the two. Issei didn't need to see her face to know who it was. Danazik's eyes narrowed with disgust. "Crimson hair, you must be of the House of Gremory." Rias Gremory gave a pleasant smile after taking the moment to eye his condition as well as the surroundings. Her face was full of questions, but politesse was her priority. "My name is Rias Gremory. How are you doing, fallen angel-san? If you are trying to hurt this boy, then I won't hold back." The fallen angel looked between Rias and Issei as though weighing the value of them both rather than finding the truth behind her words. He frowned as he found the odds weren't in his favor. "So this one belongs to you, and this town is also a part of your territory. Well, for today, I will apologize. But I advise you to not let your servant loose. People like me might slay him while having a walk." Thanks for the advice. Though her remark could never be taken seriously, there wasn't a sign of sarcasm within her. "This town is under my surveillance. So, if you get in my way, then I won't hold back. I will say the same to you, heiress of the House of Gremory. As I told the boy, my name is Danasik. I hope we won't meet again." The black-winged angel nodded once to Rias. His head turned towards Issei, who continued to stack boosts just in case. The fallen angel narrowed his eyes as though noticing the rise in physical prowess, but nodded just as well. With that, his wings fluttered open and he took off towards the sky. Leaving Issei alone with Rias. God! He winced from a sharp pain to his head. Why couldn't he be alone with her under normal circumstances? No, someone like her would never give him a second glance even if they were bound together within the same room. Instead, he was alone with her under weird circumstances. Oh, how he wanted to go into the corner and cry. The greatest beauty and total bombshell of the academy, and he had to be professional with her. "So," Issei began in a serious tone while he was crying on the inside, "what's this about me being revived as a devil, master?" Crying? No, he was sobbing and pounding his fists on the metaphorical floor. Rias Gremory was so hot and he couldn't do anything with her, not that he could have to begin with. But come on. The crimson-haired beauty turned around to look at him. She gave a radiant smile that almost melted his knees. Almost. He had to stay firm. But it didn't stop him from grinning like an idiot. "I see. So you know, that stuff that happened the other day wasn't a dream." Issei wiped the drool from his lips. "Why yeah, I kinda figured. I'm sorry for not informing you at an earlier convenience. When I tried visiting your home I couldn't find you anywhere. And with all the fuss happening lately at school I couldn't find the time to approach you either." No, Issei assured her. "I think I understand. we all have our responsibilities." She nodded in agreement. "Right, I believe we should move to a more secluded area. Where exactly do you live?" Within his metaphorical space within his head, he was now banging his skull against the ground as hard as he could while shedding tears of blood. Rias Gremory wanted to come to his place, they would be alone. It was like a dream come true. "I think here is secluded enough," was his reply. He was a pervert before he was anything else, he constantly told himself. He might as well cut off his manhood at this point. If it were true, he'd gladly bring Rias into his home. But instead, he was keeping her at bay. Screw safety. This is Rias freaking Gremory. You'll never have a chance like this again, Hyodo Issei. Sorry if I'm not so trusting right away, he elaborated when she gave him a curious look. I was attacked by fallen angels and then revived as a devil without any prior knowledge. But I suppose it would explain what's going on with my body. I am grateful that I'm still alive, but I can't help but wonder for what reason. Rias looked a little surprised. Only a little. She either had the skill to keep her emotions in check or there was a part of her that had expected him to respond this way. "You're different from how you behave at school," she began. Issei scratched his chin. "Don't get me wrong. I'm only like this when I have to be. Honestly, I'd love to bring you back home to my house. I mean, I wouldn't do anything. Not that I think you're not hot or anything. I mean, you see." Rias giggled at him. Giggled. She didn't look at him with disgust or call him a plethora of foul names. Yeah, and Yuma, Rainier acted the same way. At the sign of him grimacing, Rias placed her hands on her hips and nodded. "Very well. As you had heard, my name is Rias Gremory, heiress to the house of Gremory, and I am a devil." At her declaration, black bat-like wings sprouted out of her back, kicking up small bursts of wind at their summoning. Issei felt something stir within him at the sight of them. It felt like an urge to do something. Letting the urge flow naturally through his body, he found a familiar sensation burst through his back. But instead of sprouting from his shoulder blades, a pair of black wings sprouted at the arch of his back. His brows shot up. He hadn't realized his physiology had changed that much. And unlike his draconian wings, these didn't require a mark on his body to hide. "That's a nice look," Rias grinned. "But you shouldn't have that on your face. There are plenty of supernatural things around the world if you know where to look." Oh, he knew. He came across plenty. This was just the first time he had ever heard of real fallen angels and devils. From this point onwards, Rias went on, "Because of your death, you have been reincarnated as a devil under my peerage. I am your king. It's nice to finally meet you, Hyodo Issei. Or can I call you Aiz-kun?" She finished with a smile and a cute tilt of her head. There was a moment when Issei closed his eyes and thought. Rias was polite enough to leave him alone. However, when plenty of time had passed enough for her to grow concerned, she decided to wait further. And when that time expired, she decided to try and stir him. His eyes snapped open at the sound of her first step. Hyodo Issei, the greatest pervert who had ever walked Kuo Academy halls, was replaced with the eyes of, to be quite honest, Rias wasn't sure what could be used as a comparison. Not a beast but not human. Not an enemy but not an ally. Someone who had the eyes of one who had seen countless bloodshed but had never taken a life at the same time. But it also made Rias uneasy. The look he was giving her was like an appraiser would, judging her for all her worth. Deciding whether to abandon her, follow her, or strike her down now. And for some reason, Rias had the feeling he could. The feeling vanished as he gave her a large grin. "Wow, this is seriously like a dream come true. I'm seriously going to be with you always, senpai?" Rias blinked. "Why yes. As you are now a part of my peerage, you and I will be together from here on out. Of course, I'll have to introduce you to the others." She could swear she saw stars within his eyes. "This is so awesome. Alright. I'm Hyodo Issei, and of course you can call me Aiz. And if it weren't for you I would have been dead, so of course I'll serve you. My life is yours to do with as you please." Rias smiled. However, Issei's tone shifted to neutral. "I will determine for myself whether or not you will be my master and king. I will serve you and obey your every order, but if I don't find you worthy of my loyalty, you will find it that much harder to control me." Ch1 of 19 Next, Justin Community Forum. More 8th, The Dragoon by Erixum Anime, High School DxD, Haisuku Ru D times D rated. English, words, 388k+, faves. 1K plus, follows. 1K plus, published, July 21, 2014. Updated, July 3, 2015. 761. Chapter 2. A New Devil. A note from the author. Hello everyone and thank you for reading. So some quick mentions. I made a few mistakes from the opening chapter. They were minor but should be acknowledged, so real quick. I messed up the colors of the White Dragon Emperor's wings. To that, I say whoops. Issei's draconian eyes should be green, not gold. Again, I say whoops. Also, his natural eye color is brown when he is not activating his abilities. Issei bears the boosted gear. Not necessarily a mistake, but I didn't really mention what it was. He has wings because of something else that will be explained in the future. Also, due to his current understanding with Drake, he can't hear his voice nor can he manifest the gauntlet. Though he can still use the boost command, he cannot transfer. Yet he still has access to the scale mail. Juggernaut drive will be explained in the future. Last, he is not really part of some organization. It's a little difficult to explain but will be when the story progresses. But for those who want answers immediately, I direct you towards my other work, The Dollmaker. Chapter 4 to be exact. The character of that chapter goes into details on what a predator is. Oh, before I forget, the title of the story is called 8th, The Dragoon. I don't believe the title of Dragoon is fitting. If anyone can provide a more suitable title I would greatly appreciate it and give recognition. Now without further ado, please enjoy. With great power comes great responsibility. It was a line Issei had read in an American comic so many years ago and he had taken it to heart. After all, if he was the greatest sexual deviant to live throughout all of history, then surely he should use his perversion as a means to become the harem king, right? It was his responsibility to all perverts everywhere to set the standards on what to achieve and how high. He also had the responsibility as one who holds the title of 8th Predator. So long as he was recognized by the cognitive will of the ruler of the world as the 8th, he would forever be the world's defender. He had never been deployed to save the world from a cataclysmic event like some of his eldest senpai have. He was glad yet at the same time disappointed. He was glad because the trials he overcame on a regular basis were nothing compared to disasters that could bring humanity to extinction. He was also disappointed because he had the need to prove himself. Other than being called should the world in its entirety will be in danger, the predators were free to do whatever they pleased. They could even destroy other countries if they so choose, so long as it doesn't threaten the world's ability to progress forward. Some didn't care about foreign affairs and remained defending their home country. Some went out to be heroes like Issei, and some didn't care about others in the slightest and often brought carnage for their own sakes. As much as Issei hated those few selfish senpai, he had no right to ridicule them. They were all his equals and stood with him on fair ground. Their titles only stated their seniority, not their rank in power. 8th was just as powerful as 1st. It would be impossible arguing with one. It was a part of a silent pact between each of them to never fight against another. Not only would the battle be pointless as no victor would be able to be decided, but the battle would surely bring enough carnage to destroy their surroundings, and then some. Regardless, if they didn't want to use their ridiculous powers for good, Issei wouldn't go out of his way to try and change their minds. Just the same, they never said anything about his ideals. They never supported him, but they didn't hinder him all the same. When he asked for something of them, they usually gave it to him at a price. It was unfortunate. Despite having 7 other equals, Issei was alone. Seeing his wings blazed through space as he flew towards his destination. He was entering Roland Senpai's territory as he crossed the invisible line over the Pacific Ocean. However, 6th Predator wasn't willing to go out of his way to stop this threat and so decided to send a message to 8th. The shrimp was even willing to pay for his services. Issei wouldn't have refused regardless. He would have done it for free. It just aggravated him so much how one of his fellows wouldn't be bothered if some several thousand people were killed. The sun should be shining but instead the skies were darkened by black clouds. A storm was brewing and expanding in an unnatural pace. The clouds were too dark, the lightning was too ecstatic, and the winds were fierce enough to splice metal and concrete alike. At this rate, it would reach the shores of South America in less than an hour. Without hesitating, Issei dove into the clouds. The winds buckled and tossed him around inside his armor, but the dragon metal held firm while his wings continued to direct him to the heart. As though sensing his arrival, the storm came alive and threw everything at him. Blades of wind and bursts of lightning bombarded him. But his wings guided him to the most secure path with the least amount of penalties. He was surrounded and despite his best abilities could not proceed without damage. But what struck him was deflected with a swift punch or kick. Issei was one of the few who could claim to have ever punched lightning. His draconian wings burned brighter as he willed himself to move faster. Spiraling, twisting, zigzagging at tight corners. Whoever or whatever was directing the storm could not get a lock on his flight pattern. The lightning and wind could not leave a critical attack other than skimming the surface of his armor or to have him deflect them. Were they normal dragon wings, the wind would have affected their flight. Issei would have been useless in this storm and tossed around like a doll. It was a good thing they weren't normal. They did not use wind currents to sustain him. They used a much more abstract XYZ formula of defining space. That is to say, they moved through the first 3 dimensions by his will. But there was a price for its use. There was always a price. His senses finally picked up the core of the storm. There were 3 signatures. To the best of his abilities, he would have to say they resembled lightning, wind, and water. But at the same time those weren't the most correct of concepts to use in identifying them. They could have been storm, rain, and thunder as well. It didn't matter. He found them. There was no need for talk. Trying to convince them to go away at this deep in development of their plan was like asking a girl to willingly go out with Issei. It was just impossible. And it hurt. Without further thoughts, he engaged. This is for making me miss the Little Sister Love Fest Extended Edition release. He had waited half a year for that eroge to come out, damn it. Scene asterisk with only 2 hours of sleep, the feeling of the sun hitting his window was like a slap to the face. Being a devil sucks if he had to wake up like this every day for the rest of his life. He had gotten the rundown of what it meant to be a devil last night by Rias, or Bucko as she prefers. Devils were extremely sensitive to the light and were more susceptible to harm by weapons of light such as the fallen angel's spears. At the same time, devils were more powerful in the dark, especially at night. Unfortunately, further explanations were cut short when Issei received that emergency message from his senpai. He had to excuse himself, run home, and then take off after preparations. He came home a few hours before dawn smelling like smoked chicken. His armor protected him well against some of the fatal attacks, but the channeling of electricity still reached his skin. It was thanks to his draconian attributes that he could push the harm aside and keep fighting. But it was super gross when taking off his gear to find the damage had been so severe he had to shed skin. That whole process took a good hour. And not wanting to smell like fresh skin, which is gross by the way, he had to shower and scrub every inch of his body until the stench had faded. It was only then could he climb into bed and sleep. He had planned on ditching school and using the morning to recover. He was tired from fighting 3 highly ranked supernatural beings simultaneously. But that accursed sun prodded him. The sun itself was now on his shit list. Grunting, Issei pulled the covers over his head like a child and turned his back against the window. But when he turned to his side, his face pressed itself against something, soft yet firm. He didn't recall buying pillows like these. Nor could he recall bringing anything to his bed that could have been this. He juggled with his mind whether he should open his eyes to see what it was or just go to sleep. Sleep won, and so he decided to just bury his face further into this splendor. Only to hear a soft moan that slapped him just as hard as the sun had. 1 slap to the face he could ignore. 2. Now there was no hope of him going back to sleep, regardless of how tired his body. He was confused. He didn't feel so tired after all. After expending 59 times his potential over an exhausting battle, delivering rattling blows and receiving some himself, he should have been tired enough to hibernate for the rest of the season. So why did he feel so rejuvenated? Something in his bed stirred. There was something else under these sheets with him. But before he could jump out, a pair of slender arms wrapped around him and pulled him in closer between the pair of pillows. Wait. Arms, a pair of bun-shaped pillows, oh. Issei shot his eyes open, only to stare directly into a cream-colored texture with a pink perky tip. Its shape was beautiful, and one he was most familiar with from all the porn he's watched. But never before did he ever imagine seeing something like this so up close and personal. No, he must be imagining it. There's just no way any of this could be real. Sue, his sharp ears perked at the sound of soft snores. Oh, so this was really happening. This was really happening. Such a situation was only found for main protagonists of some poor in quality light novel, but still the root of Issei's envy. Oh, how he wanted to snuggle close within this bosom and cry his eyes out. This was one of his lifelong dreams. To wake up suddenly within the arms of a beautiful maiden. Being naked was just an added bonus. However, as much as he wanted to behave this way, both his mind and body were reacting in a completely different manner. WWWWWAAAAAAAA. To freak the hell out. No one could sleep through his outburst. The girl was a little startled and released her grip in just the right time when Issei instinctively jumped out of his bed, dragging the sheets along with him. When he fell to the floor, he continued to gain as much distance as possible until his back was against the dresser. Morning already? Rias Gremory sat up wearily while wiping the sleep out of her eyes. Her naked body was his to see in all its glory. Issei had heard from the girls in his class that they were nothing without their makeup and usually a mess after waking up. If this was true, then Rias Gremory was something above the standards of a woman, devil or not. Still a little groggy and her hair a little ruffled, she was still gorgeous. Her beauty was all natural and didn't need any makeup to look this amazing. It's like she would have to try to look bad. Good morning, Issei-kun, she gave him a lovely smile after gaining her bearings. Gee, good morning, bucko, Issei gulped nervously as his voice was monotone, almost mechanical. All of his attention was drawn to her exposed breasts. She stretched with her arms extended over her head, giving him an even better look at the curves of her body. And without shame, she stood from his bed and immediately went for his desk. She was just strolling in the nude for him to see without a care in the world. Oh, and look, she was dressing herself with the school uniform she must have left on his desk. Even bending over to put on her panties, and let it be known Issei could see everything. Even a pervert like him had his limits. Unless he wanted to suffer from passing out due to the extreme quantities of blood rushing to his head, he had to force himself to look away. It ached him so to turn his head against such an immaculate wonder. This was art at its finest. No god in all of existence could have crafted a more ideal figure. Those Greek statues with all their so-called perfect measurements were nothing compared to the Rias Gremory. But even something so perfect could be spoiled if gazed at it under the wrong conditions. BB bucko. I can see everything. Issei blurted out as he shut his eyes, turned his head, and covered his vision with his arm to keep her purity intact, and to hide the tears starting to gather from his eyes. He needed to be strong. This may have been a once-in-a-lifetime chance, but if such a miracle could appear within his abode then surely it could happen again. His life was within the hands of the Gremory heiress as he had sworn to serve her from here on out. They would be spending plenty of time together. So if he played his cards right, and if he behaved more of a concerned servant than some creep, then perhaps she wouldn't shun him and reward him in the future. Rias paused in her dressing to look at him. She replied nonchalantly, if you want to see it, then go ahead. The world suddenly stopped. Issei hunched his body on all fours by her words. His heart skipped a beat as he fell into a flash sweat. Impossible. Could those words be used in a sentence? Did those words exist within the Japanese language? Could the laws that made up the world in its entirety, what kept it spinning, what kept humanity thriving, could it allow such words to be spoken? Could the Rias Gremory be giving him, Hyodo Issei, permission to observe her naked body? Yes, she was. Issei had just seen the truth of the world. And it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Nay, it was so magnanimous he couldn't look directly at it else be burned by its brightness. This time, he did not hide the tears nor did he hold them back. His eyes poured streams of manliness as the elder gods of perversion and debauchery were smiling at them. He knew this path would reward him someday. Lo and behold, he didn't just get any girl naked before him, he got the girl. By the way, how are you feeling? Putting his mental breakdown aside, Issei looked up by her words. Perhaps she knew something about him due to their new link and had been able to detect the condition of his body. He couldn't tell unless he had a little more information about what it meant to be her servant. While fixing the position of her bra, Rias elaborated, I took the liberty of replenishing you with some of my own energy since you looked so tired when I arrived. The process took some time and your bed was quite comfy, so I must have dozed off at the end. I initially tried to enter as soon as you returned home, but I had difficulty. It wasn't until I had Akano examine the structure of your defenses could I teleport here. Honestly, if I haven't you would have slept until nightfall. she concluded with a small sigh and a hand to her head as though this was deeply troubling. Never mind the breaking and entering part of her explanation. Issei wasn't sure what to say other than, "Thank you. But bucko, why were you naked in the first place?" Oh, it makes it that much easier for me to transfer energy. Clothes usually disrupt the flow, so I took the liberty of disrobing the both of us." Issei took a moment to think about her words. He blinked and looked down at himself. He blanched. True to her words, he was naked as was the day he was born. Tired or not, he should have sensed someone entering his home. He especially should have noticed someone stripping him in his sleep. Feeling so violated, Issei wrapped the sheet all over him and turned away from Rias, shivering and sobering nonsense about never being able to get married. Like a little girl. "You're not a normal human, are you, Issei-kun?" The boy realized something else at that moment. When she stripped him of all his clothing, including the skin-tight underclothes, she must have seen what was etched onto his back. With the sound of her clothes shifting against her skin, Rias continued in a firm tone, "You were able to wound 2 fallen angels, place several different types of anti-infiltration traps to keep both the supernatural and mundane at bay within your home, and let's not begin with your energy signature being completely different from that of a human and devil. Issei, just what are you?" She didn't mention his wings. Why? Issei turned his head and gave his best smile. He recited what he had practiced in front of the mirror 100 of times, albeit poorly. "Everyone has their secrets, bucko." Rias cocked a brow, but shrugged. "Fair enough. I'll not pry if you don't want to share. But I hope you can trust me enough one day to tell me." "Thank you, bucko." He gave a better smile. As his supposed master, Rias had it within her rights to order him to share his secrets. He had promised to serve her accordingly, however if she had ordered it then he would have provided the bare minimum. Yet she respected his privacy and he could sense the good intentions within her. It was probably why he had been able to sleep without noticing her. There wasn't a shred of malevolence from her, unlike with Yuma. Her actions and words were sincere and truly meant only for his best interest. If this was how Rias Gremory ruled, then she might be worthy of him calling her king. Scene: Rias Wanisama. No, with him of all people? Impossible. Why? It was a strange feeling. Arriving on several battlefields and feeling malevolence directed towards him upon his arrival, Issei wasn't unfamiliar to the feelings of dark intentions. Soldiers, mercenaries, crusaders, terrorists, all of these things always looked at him with the desire to kill him. Usually Issei moved too fast for any of them to succeed, let alone identify him other than as the red blur. He also moved too fast to look at their faces. But the feeling as a whole was always like walking through a thick mist. It surrounded him and made him shiver by how cold it was, but nowhere near enough to stop him in his tracks. This feeling, however, was transcendently different. Hellfire of bullets, tank shells, missiles, magic, and mystic beasts he could withstand and charge on without hesitation. He stared into the face of evil quite a few times. He's pissed off a few of his senpai before and invoked the wrath of Serene Senpai, the divine beast predator. Simply, he seems some of the worst the world had to offer. But all of that paled in comparison to walking side by side with Rias Gremory. Straight through the academy gates, in front of everyone. The amount of murder intent radiating off of teenagers surpassed anything he'd ever face. As a pervert, he had felt it from his classmates before, but never at this scale. Apparently just being seen with the unapproachable goddess of the academy triggered everyone's inner ability to revert their nature to their primal state. Perhaps it was because he wasn't in his true form, hiding behind his, nearly, indestructible armor was he so intimidated by them? While he was shivering and trying his best to make himself as small of a target as possible, Rias seemed to either pay them no mind or was ignorant of their intentions. Hopefully it was the former. When they reached their shoe lockers, Rias turned towards him and said, "I'll send someone to get you after class. See you later, Issei-kun." "Wait, what?" Issei asked as he was fixing his shoes. But Rias more than likely didn't hear him or didn't intend to stick around regardless. She was already walking away. Sighing and doing his best to ignore the evil glares directing towards him, and failing, Issei figured he might as well get today over with and head to his classroom. He didn't intend on attending today, but with his body rejuvenated of stamina thanks to Rias he figured he might as well go. Thankfully, Rias didn't ask any further questions about his background other than his current living arrangement. He didn't expect her to be understanding. She was surprisingly such a nice person once you get to know her. But first, he had something important to take care of. However, this task was interrupted as something crashed into his left temple. "Eyes, you bastard! We demand an explanation." Matsuda and Motohama had appeared, the former delivering a superhuman blow powered by his passion of sexual envy while the latter looked calm yet had a predatory glare behind his glasses. Issei, having been surrounded by harmful intentions, could not detect their approach as they too had blended in with the school body to the finest detail. The punch Matsuda gave was strong enough to bypass his draconian skin and send his head crashing into the wall. A human had done this, one below average of the mundane populace at that. Such is the power of a pervert. What happened to you after we split up? To appear the next day with the Rias Gremory, Motohama shifted his glasses, the glare shifting enough for Issei to see a peek of his bloodthirsty eyes. "We were the unpopular alliance, comrades," Matsuda cried, shedding actual tears of betrayal. However, Issei recovered himself and wiped the blood off his brow. A large grin plastered across his face as though he had achieved a victory over the both of them. To a certain perspective, he had. "Guys, have you seen real tits before? Getting in touch with Shitori-senpai will have to wait. He had bragging rights to exploit." Scene. Issei hated chess. Hated it with a passion. He liked playing games, so that wasn't the problem. He can't even say he hated the game itself. Rather, he hated the whole process of playing. Issei never was a schemer. He was the sort to charge in head first with his ridiculous power. Roland Senpai did say that any problem can be solved with violence, and if it didn't work, then one wasn't using enough. To this day, Issei never had a problem solving any of his problems with his fists. That is, until he met Sona Shitori, the current student council president. It all began back when he was a first year. Due to the responsibilities he had placed on himself, Issei's attendance record had a few holes here and there. Though most teachers didn't mind since he gave a decent excuse and still did an average job on his homework and tests. However, questions were raised when Issei would return the following day covered in bandages. What first started off as a few cuts here and there which could be found doing household tasks from one living by himself, Issei soon came back to school with bruises, burns, broken bones, and sometimes he didn't return for extended periods. Naturally, at this point the teachers were concerned and sought to find the reasons behind his mishaps. At least they did until they got to know the boy a little better and dug up his old files from middle school. He as well as his two friends were renowned as the perverted trio. Upon inquiring information from his friends as well as some of the girls who had known the three, the teachers had come to a conclusion that Issei had gotten himself in trouble and his victims tended to go overboard on their retribution. Sona was different. The once vice president at the time could recognize the quality of wounds Issei bore. That, and there was also the fact she was much more perceptive than the average devil. The wounds were merely a means to get her attention. And once it was captured, she was able to see little things about the Hyodo boy that shouldn't be found on a normal teenage boy. The way he stood, the way he was always conscious of his surroundings, the way he walked, the way he kept his hands at ready, everything. Although, for the life of her, she wasn't sure whether his perverted nature was just a facade or not. It would have been a marvelous mask if so. Unfortunately, Issei really was as perverted as he acted. There was also the amount of interest her dear friend, Rias Gremory, took upon the human boy. Sona had been able to start to sense the amount of potential dwelling within the boy. She wasn't sure whether it was a sacred gear ready to awaken or if the boy was one of those ever so rare magicians born within a mundane family. Regardless, because Rias had her eyes on Issei, Sona suddenly had the craving to place him into her peerage. It was the main reason why she approached him one day and demanded answers from him. She claimed it was her sworn duty as vice president to concern herself with the well-being of students she thought might be getting into trouble. He was just as sharp as she had expected and knew right off the bat she wasn't being completely honest, though he did well to keep his thoughts from being expressed through his tone and gestures. It ended up with her paying him a home visit. Since he had refused to share his secrets, she decided to put him into a corner. Once being permitted inside, ignoring the stupid grin on his face as well as some drooling, Sona used her position as vice president to demand he tell her the truth or she will be forced to take it up with the director of the academy. If he really was involved in hooligan affairs or sexually assaulting women, then she would have no choice but to report him, at least that was the reason she gave him. Backing him into a corner was a mistake. She received what she desired: answers. However, never before did she feel so threatened. She learned everything. What happened to his parents, his condition, and what he does on a regular basis when alone. All he did was tell her. Yet, by looking at those eyes as he told her everything, she knew the roles had been reversed. What was a king looking for a new piece to add to her peerage ended up becoming a damsel imprisoned by a fearsome dragon, both figuratively and literally. His tone might have been light, if not serious, but it sang with power enough to make her elder sister look like a child. It was as if his presence itself was enforced by all the powers of the world. What did it mean to be eighth predator? Issei was a good child with a warm heart. He never asked anything from Sona on that day other than to keep his secret to herself. What he didn't know, through his naivety, was that it wasn't so much as a promise as it was an order. Because Sona feared for her life what would happen should she ever betray him. The thought of reporting him to one of the four Satans, particularly to her sister the current Leviathan, came up once. But then, what would they do about it? Would they feel so threatened as to try to capture him? And if so, what would happen should he fight back? However, the news of the Red Dragon Emperor arriving in the human world had already been surfaced in the underworld. It would only be a matter of time before someone figured out Hyodo Issei was the current wielder of the boosted gear. Of course, Issei never learned of her intentions and never learned she was a devil. He honestly did think she was a concerned, if not nosy, student council officer. Regardless, she always went out of her way to cover for him whenever he missed classes. On rare occasions she even tutored him, though it wasn't like he could ever focus with the third most popular girl in all Kuo Academy alone with him. And ever since Roland Senpai started to send his leftover jobs and emergencies his way, Issei had asked Sona to teach him how to write and submit reports. He never was good at that kind of thing. Sona was hesitant at first and told him he shouldn't be saving people for compensation, but when he argued he would have done it regardless if there was money or not, she relented. Rather than teaching him, she agreed to do it herself under a few conditions. First, he was to never hide any information that would come up. Second, he was to come directly to her after every instance he had gone out, and would have been satisfied with receiving a phone call or email should either of them be immediately unavailable. And third, he would play chess with her at every chance he could. Which led to now. Issei grunted for the umpteenth time as he sat alone with Sona in the student council room. The red and black pieces were arranged in the red's favor, the president's favor. Issei was losing horrendously. Though over the course of a year and a half he had made some progress. Sona didn't beat him under 3 moves like the first time. Today, she could beat him in 6. The point was for Issei to learn to use his brains rather than his fists, which was a really long and strenuous lesson for the both of them. Issei wasn't stupid, but he did lack most forms of common sense as well as strategic tact. Plus he was rather impatient. Still, he had learned how to be on the defensive, how to read moves, and how to control his frustration to think clearly. It's what helped him thus far return with fewer wounds. It still didn't help that Sona was leagues more intelligent than him. Checkmate. Sona announced without having to look up from her laptop. Sona was one of those rare individuals who could type with one hand. She didn't break her flow even as she removed one hand to move her bishop across the field, effectively cornering his king. She didn't even have to look at the board. She knew where every piece was in the map in her head. Issei slammed his head against the table. Though he had come a long way in tempering his frustrations, losing 9 times in one sitting will always be demoralizing. Is there anything else you need to share, Ai-san? Their relationship was a peculiar one. While Issei would assume they were friends, Sona always kept him at a distance as though she couldn't like him. Like she was tolerating his existence and just helping him out because it was her duty as the student council president. Well, it was to be expected. He chose the life of a pervert, after all. The truth was, to this day, Sona Sitri, a high-class devil, was terrified of the existence that was Hyodo Issei. She was always respectful towards him, always minded his feelings, and always made sure to never anger him. She knew Issei was a good person, but it didn't stop her instincts from screaming at her to live under any circumstance. If one were to find themselves locked in a cage with a sleeping lion, imagine what that individual would do in order to survive. So long as this dragon wasn't hungry, she could be friends with it. And imagine, there were 7 more monstrosities out there in the world. Over the course of the year, they had grown fairly close enough to break through at least some of the stuffy honorifics. He was fine with being called Eyes, which only his closest friends called him. But at the same time he wasn't comfortable with calling her by her first name because he had such high respect for her and said she was his senior. The boy never realized the roles were quite reverse. Sona had once figured that if he were a devil, he would automatically be in ultimate class should his secret be revealed. He'd be elevated to the highest pinnacle by default. He wouldn't need finances, some grand deed of military grandeur, or recognition from the rating games. Although, the former two wouldn't be a problem for someone like him even if he had to start from the bottom. Unfortunately for her, Sona had yet to learn of Issei's involvement with Rias Gremory. Issei lifted his head. No, I think that's everything. You can send it now. Sona nodded and did as was instructed. She shut her laptop, pushed it aside, and went back to finishing her tea. Thank you for everything Shitori-senpai. Issei scratched the back of his head like the goofball that he was. I can write essays and turn in reports from school just fine, but official documents like that? I really don't want Roland-san to get mad at me if I do it wrong. She shook her head. It's no trouble at all. As I've told you before, I find your actions admirable. Foolish and naive, but admirable. Issei tried to not flinch, but to no avail. Ai-san, are you absolutely sure those were the things you fought against? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Though he had said those words, Issei had to look up out of habit when he thought. I mean, who could ever mistake Fujin, Kazejin, and Sujin? I think that's why Roland-san sent me the message. He hates anything that comes from Japan and would more than likely have let people die instead of stopping them. Sona fixed the position of her glasses. Are you quite sure it was them though? Have you faced gods before? Issei crossed his arms as he thought a little more seriously. No, I can't say that I have. I've fought a lot of monsters though. I wouldn't call them gods, but I have also fought against spirits that manifest as natural disasters. But actual mythological beings? No. He thought about telling her about the fallen angel incident. But Sona didn't need to know about that. He's already troubled her enough today. Sona studied him for a bit, her sharp eyes trying to make a reading of his thoughts based on his facial features. However, she quickly realized his mind had wandered elsewhere. She learned from experience once Issei had lost focus anything can enter his mind. It was best to not try and figure out what he was thinking about. I see, she concluded. You may go now. I still have my own business to take care of before lunch ends. Issei stood and gave a small bow. Thank you again Shitori-senpai. I'd be lost without you. Have a good day. Before he left, she called out to him. Oh yes. One more thing. Hyodo-san, for what reason did you arrive with Rias this morning? If only Issei was just 1 second ahead. His hand was on the handle of the door and even turned. If he was only 1 second faster he could have opened it and then used it as a means to escape. She had called him by his family name, which meant serious business. She only did that when she was either A, upset, or B, disappointed. Her voice was definitely tense. There was a rumor that Rias and Sona were very close friends. It would only be natural for one friend to be concerned for the other should said friend be together with a super pervert like him. He was beginning to sweat. Sona was extremely sharp. She would be able to tell if he was lying. But there was no way in hell he could tell her about Rias visiting him this morning. Naked at that. She would ask questions on why Rias would have to arrive and then he would have to tell her about being a devil. Aha! He got it. Oh, I've recently joined the Occult Research Club, ha, ha ha. He gave a shaky laugh in high hopes she would accept it. It wasn't a lie at all, but it wasn't the truth at the same time. Since he couldn't look at her in fear she would see through his deception, he had failed to miss her eyes widening and face paling. However, she expertly concealed her shock. I see. Thank you, Ai-san. Have a good day as well. Rias had skipped her last period in order to properly prepare herself for the arrival of her newest pawn. As usual, the Occult Research Club located at the old school building was dimly lit with only candles aflame. For the heightened vision of devilkind, this was the most comfortable setting. She also had the whole room to herself at the moment. Akeno would arrive in a few minutes and the rest of her peerage would come after school. It was the perfect moment to get out of her clothes and take a relaxing shower. By the time she had finished, her queen was there to hand her a towel with the same mirthful smirk across her face. So how is our newest member? Hamejima Akeno placed a warm cup of tea as was prepared to the liking of her king. Once said king was dried and fully clothed. Rias took a seat at her desk and gave a heavy sigh. I'm not too sure what to make of him. As a human he was able to take on those fallen angels and it looked like he was about to win if he wasn't stabbed from behind. And he keeps disappearing when I tried to get close to him. The first attempt he wasn't home at all and the second attempt he took off after receiving some email. But here's the thing. I sensed he came home, lost his signature, and then it reappeared hours before dawn. Whatever he was doing tired him out. Akeno gave a small chuckle. Oh, I could tell there is something more to him than meets the eye. Just look at the wards placed around his house. Those were the workings of a competent magician. But it confuses me because they were built as though they never thought of a devil examining them, and it was so intricate too. What a shame. Rias leaned forward with her elbows propped against her desk. He's already said two remarkable things to me. First, we all have our responsibilities. And second, everyone has their secrets. What do you think it means, Akeno? The queen tilted her head and tapped a slender finger against her chin and thought. It sounds like someone who has a heavy burden on them. It makes sense seeing as it took all 8 of your pawn pieces to revive him. You don't think he's affiliated with the magician faction, do you? Rias shook her head. As you said, the barrier was built as though the magician who made it had never heard of the existence of devils. Issei could have taught himself hedge magic. It could explain how he was able to take on those fallen angels, but he doesn't produce a strong enough energy signature to be anything but a normal human, concluded Akeno. The king nodded. Though the output is low to that of a normal human, it is also different in texture. I'm not sure what to make of it. Plus, during the treatment I gave him, there was something on his back. Rias narrowed her eyes. Those tattoos were too defined in their geometric patterns to be done by normal means. And normal tattoos don't breathe like that. It was more like a symbiotic organism than a pair of fluorescent inked wings. Do you think that, maybe, he's awakened his sacred gear? Asked Akeno. It is possible. It could be like Yuto's where it doesn't need an instrument to activate. But even Yuto's sword birth manifests as something. I've never heard of a sacred gear without an actual form. Rias paused for a moment as she recalled something else. Akeno, he said he would forever serve me. But he also said it would be determined if I am worthy of being his king. And if not, then it would be difficult for me to control him. The vice president of the fake club thought to herself. Does this worry you, bucko? Of course it does. Rias gave a heavy sigh. He told me right away he didn't trust me. I'm worried he won't be able to. You worry too much. The Gremory family is known for treating their peerage different than other devils. If you give him space and open yourself up to him like you have for any of us, I'm sure he will do the same. For now let's. There was a knock on the door. The two looked at another before Rias straightened herself. Enter. She had been expecting one of her subordinates as it was around the time they would start to arrive. However, she was taken by surprise when her childhood friend entered instead. Sona, Rias blinked. What can I do for you? The sea tree devil fixed her glasses as her face spoke of all business. Rias, I need to know something. What is your affiliation to Hyodo Issei? Again, Rias blinked. Issei? I could have sworn we had talked about this a while back. Well, due to recent events, I had to make a move sooner than expected. Issei is now a member of my peerage as my pawn. Her brows came together in confusion when she saw her friend blanch. Not only that, but her eyes had widened and her composure threatened to break. Akeno tilted her head in curiosity. She recognized the look as one who had lost hope. But she would say nothing as it wasn't her place. Sona, what's wrong? Rias was beginning to worry about her friend's abnormal behavior. Sona Seatree was always calm and collective. You'd sooner see the crimson moon than see Sona behave, well, the way she was right now. She didn't even act this way whenever news of Leviathan paying a visit. I can't believe you went along with it. Rias, the Seatree heiress began slowly and in a low tone, do you know anything about Hyodo-san? Sona, the Gremory heiress replied in the same tone, do you? He and I have something of an understanding at the moment. There is not much I can share with you, even in the name of our friendship, Sona explained after a bit of silence. So I'll ask again, do you know anything about him? Rias frowned as her eyes narrowed. Sona, is Issei blackmailing you with something? The school president fixed her glasses and gave a small sigh. No, nothing of the sort. Then what is it? She paused for a while longer. Her eyes shut as she took in a brief breath of air. It would seem you know nothing about him at all. Rias, you may have made a grave mistake. Hyodo Issei is a force you will not be able to control. Rias frowned further. The words Issei shared with her last night rang through her head. If he deemed her unworthy, he so stated, she will have difficulty controlling him. You know what he is, don't you? Issei wasn't a normal human after all, was he? Rather than answering, Sona asked, exactly how many pieces did you use in reviving him? And why did you need to do so in the first place? I'll answer that question if you tell me how you know about him. I'll not ask what he is. He can tell me that when he wants to. But I feel like I should know why you know so much about my newest pawn when I don't. I'm not asking for curiosity's sake, Rias. I'm asking because I'm worried for you. I'm trying to offer you a trade to escape from a potential catastrophe. Both Rias and Akeno faltered. Akeno couldn't keep up the smile any longer and Rias couldn't keep up the friendly atmosphere. Do you have any idea what you're trying to ask for? Rias' tone was dangerous. You're asking one king to hand over someone of their peerage without reason. I understand exactly what I am asking for. Sona didn't stand down. It's because of what I know I am stepping over a few bounds. And if he hasn't told you already, then I shouldn't. Just know this isn't something you will be able to contain. And you can? Absolutely not, Sona shook her head. However, I've had the misfortune of getting to know Issei for the year. I know all there is about him. I know how he thinks and what he reacts to. Does that mean I will be a better king than you? Not in the slightest. I know I will never be able to control him if he so decided to do something I didn't agree with. I mean no disrespect to you or how you rule your peerage, but I'm asking for the sake of avoiding anything disastrous. The best I would be able to do is to direct the carnage to keep damages to a minimum. Rias was growing impatient. She tapped a finger on the desk. Disaster? Like what? You're making it sound like he's a force of nature. Sure, he could take on a few fallen angels, but I don't think he would have been defeated if he was what you're making him out to be. Sona blinked. What? What's this about fallen? There was a knock on the door and seconds afterwards a pair of students entered. The first was Rias Knight, the blonde-haired Kiba Yuto. The other following close behind was her newest pawn, Hyodo Issei. Bucko, I've brought. Yuto began but cut himself off after noticing the tension around the room. But he kept his charming smile and tried to ease things down in his particular manner. Kaichu, it's good to see you. I didn't expect you to be here. Sona didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on Issei. The pawn's attention was directed from examining the scenery of the room towards the student president at the mentioning of her presence. Their eyes locked for a moment. While she blanched and bit her lip to appear as stern as she normally would, he gave her a large smile. Oh hey there Shitori-senpai. What are you doing here? Ria's brow twitched at the familiarity he expressed. There really was something going on between the two of them that she didn't know about. Sona wasn't the sort to lie. But she didn't believe that little story about knowing him for a year. More curious now, Rias decided to let things play out. Issei called her by her alias, which meant he didn't know she was a devil. How will Sona respond? The sea-tree heiress adjusted her glasses. Hello there Ai-san. Kiba-san. I was just discussing with Rias about your sudden enrollment in this club. Sona and I were discussing whether or not to transfer you over to her peerage, Rias spoke up. She wasn't in the mood to play this game with anyone. Sona spun around, her eyes wide as though she had been betrayed. Peerage? Issei looked over to Rias in confusion. He blinked a few times as his mind started to process what she meant. When it was done, to say he was shocked would be an understatement. Shitori-senpai, you're a devil too? Yuto looked over to Akeno and gave a silent question with his eyes. She replied with a shrug and a small smile. Sona turned back around and addressed Issei with fortification. That is correct. Here in the human world I am under an alias. However, I am Sona Sea-tree of the House of Sea-tree, a high-class devil and a king much like Rias. At the moment I am without any pawns. Thus was I discussing with Rias if she was willing to make a trade with me. I'm sorry for not informing you about this. Rias stood up and circled around her desk. Though she leaned against it and appeared casual, she did tense at the feeling of fear coming from her friend. There had to be a reason for Sona's behavior. And if it was enough for the sea-tree heiress to constantly be on her toes at the moment, then Rias will do everything she can to protect her dear friend. Akeno shifted her footing after noticing the composure of her king. Likewise, Yuto's body tensed, though he was unsure what was going to happen. Issei scratched his cheek. Whether he noticed his surroundings was up in the air. Well, it's not like I had any reason to know. Nothing like this came up before. Besides, everyone has their secrets. But what's this about a trade? Sona shifted her glasses once more, using the gesture to hide her relief. So you're not mad? No, of course you're not. I don't know why I was like this. Shitori-senpai. Issei spoke up as he couldn't hear what she was saying. Or do I call you Shitori-senpai from now on? Gradually, the others relaxed. Please continue to call me as you normally would, she replied clearly. As for the trade, I am welcoming you into my peerage provided you and Rias both agree to it. I've no right to take a piece from another king. But if you so choose to remain with Rias, I can only ask that you please look before you leap. Issei winced. He knew what she was referring to. Yes, Shitori-senpai. I owe Bucko my life, so I'll be staying in her company. Thank you for the offer though. I know for sure I would have respected you as my master if things were different. Rias tried to not scowl. But on the other hand there was hope for her yet. Issei seemed to be a good guy. If someone as strict and stern as Sona could get his respect, then surely someone as loving as her could earn it as well. Right? I believe I've humiliated myself enough, Sona said. Rias, I'm sorry for causing a scene and hope this can be forgotten. Ai-san, I do hope you won't cause my friend any trouble. And please continue to see me when you are having problems. My doors are still open to you. Good day, everyone. With that, Sona left the Occult Research Club. Scene. Yuto. Have you seen Kaneko? Rias asked once things had settled down. Everyone took a seat while Akeno began serving tea. She was supposed to be here by now. Yuto wanted to ask what the whole fiasco was about just now but decided it would be better to save it for later. He gave the best smile he could despite the lone drop of sweat starting to form at his brow. Why yeah, about that. We managed to run into her on our way over here. Rias cocked a brow, gesturing for him to continue. When he didn't, she looked over towards Issei, who in return hung his head in despair. Well, Yuto scratched his left cheek as he was trying to find the right words. I don't know how to put this, but when we ran into her and I introduced Hyodo-kun to her, she. Akeno cackled, Bucko, I think you'll find out if you look outside the window. The Gremory heiress didn't quite understand how looking out the window will provide her any answers. But she trusted her queen and so did as was suggested. And it was a good thing she didn't bring her tea along with her, else a sudden spit take would have stained the glass. Instead she choked on her spit. Kaneko, her rook, was stuck in a tree. She was sitting on one of the thickest branches with her knees tucked close to her body. Her eyes were glaring all manner of hatred through the old school building. And once Rias traced what she was looking at, her eyes would have met Issei. But it was impossible seeing as how the wall blocked off all vision and the angle of the tree branch's position was too low for her to look through the window. How Kaneko knew where Issei was sitting was beyond her. What did you do to her? Rias sighed. I didn't do anything, cried Issei. He bowed his head and began fiddling with his fingers. All I did was say hi to my Kahai when she just hissed at me and climbed that tree. She called me a bunch of names and told me to stay away from her or else I'd regret the day I was born. By this point, Issei slid off the couch and began making drawings on the carpet with his finger. Rias didn't know what to make of this. She knew Issei was something special, but she didn't realize how much trouble he would be bringing along with him. First Sona and now Kaneko. What's next? I've never seen Kaneko act that way, Yuto stated. Come to think about it, I'd have to say this is the most we've seen her do. Well, Hyodo-kun, I'd heard a lot from your reputation, but I think it precedes you. This made Issei even more depressed. Rias clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. Well, Kaneko aside, I believe everyone is accounted for. So, Ise-kun, we, the Occult Research Club, welcome you. She smirked before finishing with, as devils. Issei's attention snapped into focus once the flutter of wings was heard. He looked around. Rias had her gothic wings exposed just as well as Akeno's and Yuto's. That same feeling as before swelled within Issei with his wings wanting to burst free. However, he suppressed it. There just wasn't enough space for them to be exposed without something breaking from where he was sitting. Now why don't we all take a seat? I'm sure you have plenty of questions. The red-haired devil waved a hand towards the sofas. Issei and Yuto sat together on one while Rias took the opposing one. Akeno introduced herself to Issei while she refilled everyone's cup. When done, she took her seat beside the Gremory heiress. That man you met last night was a fallen angel, Rias began. Issei nodded. Yeah, I managed to convince him to share a bit of information with me. To be honest, I'm having a difficult time believing any of this. Sure, I've heard of angels and devils before in biblical lore, but I've never expected to run into actual ones. Rias shook her head. Understand, that wasn't an angel, but a fallen angel. There is a distinction. They are the former angels who served God, but they were beings who have fallen to hell because they had evil intentions. They are also the enemy of us devils. She took a sip of her tea to let the information soak into his head. He took the moment as well to take a drink, but his eyes shone with anticipation and curiosity. He was absorbed in this and was craving information. We, the devils, have been at war with the fallen angels since ancient times, she went on. We have been fighting over the possession of the underworld, which is also known as hell in the human world. The underworld is split into two areas, one for devils and one for fallen angels. The devils form pacts with humans and receive their sacrifices and increase their strength. The fallen angels on the other hand control humans to eliminate devils. At this point the angels come in to destroy these two races on God's orders, which create the three forces. This has been going on since before anyone can remember. That man, Donasi, said this was your territory, Issei mentioned, his eyes sharp as his perverted persona faded away. If the fallen angels are your enemy and are trespassing on your land, shouldn't it be within your rights to expel them? Rias gave a pleasant smile, finding his logic keen. There is something of an armistice between the three factions. Granted, small skirmishes do happen here and there between the groups. Anything that might get out of hand has the strong potential of triggering another war. So long as the fallen angels aren't causing trouble, even if they are lingering within my territory, I can't just kick them out. Even when they tried to kill me. His eyes narrowed. She sighed. This is where it gets complicated. Last night I was forced to accept that man's so-called apology because I can't afford any retribution from the fallen angel faction. However, in regards to before, I'm sorry but I can't seek out justice if a human was involved. Humans are considered the additional party, and if they are not in affiliation to any of the other group, then we have no right to interfere whatsoever. Just as we devils must take care of our own affairs, so too must the humans. So long as the secret of our existence isn't released to the populace, there's nothing I can really do about it. And this doesn't change now that I am a devil. It only means that they can't come after you without a reasonable cause. She shrugged and then crossed her legs. She didn't even care Issei had scored a panty shot. Despite how serious he was a pervert first and foremost. As you are now a member of my peerage, you are under my protection as a pawn of the Gremory heiress. However, they may try again if they went as far as to disguise themselves as a human to get close to you. Issei frowned. He recalled the date he had with Amano Yuma. They said I have something called a sacred gear. He scratched his head as he tried to remember what it was called. The memory was still a little fuzzy, but he could recall all of it. It just hurt a bit to attempt. What is that exactly? Yuto was the one to answer this time. Sacred gear is an irregular power that is bestowed to certain humans. Most of the people whose names are recorded in history are said to be possessors of a sacred gear. They used the power of their sacred gear to record their name in history. Presently, Akeno spoke up as well. There are people who possess sacred gears within their bodies. You know, those people who play an important role worldwide. Most of those people possess a sacred gear. But what exactly is a sacred gear? Issei repeated the question with a bit more clarity in his tone. I think it would be best to show you. Rias finished her tea before standing up. Eyes, I want you to close your eyes. He gave her a dumbfounded look. She swore she could see the question marks float around his head. Just do it. He shrugged but obeyed. Good, now I want you to look deep into yourself and channel all of your energy throughout your being. Start with the heart and let it flow everywhere else. Akeno tilted her head and asked, Bucko, don't you think this is a little advanced for him? We're not even sure if he knows how to channel his devil energy. Rias replied proudly, perhaps not, but it looks like he knows what he's doing. True to her words, Issei's concentration was absolute. He looked to be at peace with himself. Now I want you to shape that energy into the strongest substance you can imagine. It could be a sword, a shield, a piece of armor or equipment. Anything. Focus all of it into one mass and channel it wherever you believe is most fitting. His eyes snapped open immediately. For a second, she could have sworn she saw his eyes glow green. But when she blinked they were his usual shade of brown. So it's called a sacred gear. I always wondered what it was. Issei-kun, Yuto inquired. Do you mean you can already activate your sacred gear? The pawn rubbed his left wrist. I suppose you could say that. Akino's smile grew a tiny fraction more. Rias was rather excited. This is good. Issei, what can your sacred gear do? Fukushako, he instead addressed Akino. You said sacred gears are found throughout the world in humans. Is it common for any of the factions to attack them? Akino gave a light chime of laughter. Era. Please just call me Akino Wanisama. And I can't say for certain. But in special cases, like yours, it is possible for one group to attack if they deem the possessor a big enough threat. Issei's sweat dropped. I'd rather not. You're my senior after all. Fufufu. Then I'll settle for Hamejima Wanisama. Issei didn't respond to that. He went back to Rias instead. Bucko, exactly how did you come about finding me and resurrecting me? Though he was being polite and kept a warm smile up, Rias could hear the hint of suspicion in his words. He didn't trust her. She supposed it was understandable, given the circumstances. She shrugged to herself and decided to answer honestly. I've been keeping an eye on you for quite some time. There are a few humans attending this school who have the potential of wielding sacred gears. I'm not too sure which ones do and don't. However, it was undeniable with you and so I thought about recruiting you to my peerage. Unfortunately I never succeeded in finding the right moment to talk to you and explain what I just told you. But who would have believed we were devils ruling the school and going against fallen angels? After all, you were just a normal high school student. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not in suspicion, but in curiosity, or at least I thought you were. You did very well in fooling everyone. I'd have to say you're nothing short of a genius to have come up with a facade of debauchery. Not to mention humble and shameless to be the bane of women everywhere for so long. These are the things I admire about you. No one pays a second glance at a pervert after all. This morning you could have taken full advantage of our situation but instead you were concerned for my modesty. Right. Issei had to look away from his king as he nonchalantly sipped his tea. Facade. Yuto raised a hand as though still attending a class. Bucko? What do you mean? Sorry but I'm a little out of the loop. Rias smiled proudly as though it was her who achieved something so great. Issei was able to hold his own against a fallen angel. By the looks of things, he was winning. Unfortunately, he went down due to a cheap shot from behind. If Akino and I hadn't sensed the fallen angel's energies, Issei would have been long dead. And Hyodo-kun did this as a human? Yuto asked for reassurance. His eyes went over towards the subject of the matter. Having been the center of everyone's ire due to his choices in life, Issei had no idea how to react towards admiration and praise. He shuffled in his seat and continued to use the teacup as a means to draw out time, even when it had been empty for some time. Akino had seen this and refilled his cup a few times. After a while he cleared his throat. Regardless, they attacked me because of my sacred gear even if I had nothing to do with them. He leaned back as he looked across the room, staring into open space. His mind was full of thoughts Rias couldn't theorize of what. Whatever the reason, it was more than enough to scare them into acting so desperately. Bucko, how long have you been keeping an eye on me? Rias sipped her tea before answering. About a little more than a year. Ever since you entered Kuo Academy I would have to say. So around the time Shitori-senpai. Whatever he was about to say was drawled off in his thoughts. Speaking of which, she crossed her legs again. What is your relationship with Sona? She was very concerned about you before you entered. Issei put his cup down and scratched his cheek. He made noises of thought to gain as much time as possible to find a suitable answer. He didn't try to hide the epiphany as he snapped his fingers when finding an appropriate response. Shitori-senpai helps me out with class assignments and sometimes tutors me. Yeah, that's it. The room was silent. No one believed his excuse but no one was going to call him out on it. I think it is starting to turn into more of an interrogation than an introduction. Rias sighed and waved her hand in dismissal. I apologize for that, Issei-kun. Well, I think that'll be all for today. Why don't you head home and let the information soak in? Tomorrow we can get started on your duties as a devil. Issei grimaced. You're not going to have me dealing in the trade of souls, are you? Rias gave a light laugh. No, we no longer deal in acquiring souls from humans. Although there are some groups that do, likely the oldest of clans. I assure you we the Occult Research Club, do not partake in any of that. I'll tell you all about it tomorrow. For now, have a good night, eyes. I hope you're a bit more rested by tomorrow. Ah, that's good, Issei gave a sigh of relief. He then stood and bowed. Thank you for your hospitality, bucko. And thank you for the tea, Hamejima-senpai. Oni-sama, Akeno corrected. Issei just did his best to keep the smile. He then gave the same departing gesture towards Yuto and excused himself from the room. Akeno laughed into her hand. Oh my, he seems to be quite the character. Rias nodded in agreement. Bucko? Yuto raised his hand once more. Are we going to do anything about Kaneko-chan? It wasn't like Rias had forgotten about her rook. It was more like she didn't know how to get a startled cat out of a tree. She wasn't going to like having to deal with Kaneko's claws. Previous ch2 of 19 next, Chapter 3, Someone to Love. A note from the author. Thank you everyone who has taken such an interest in this story. I'm not going to lie, this story has the least amount of seriousness in it compared to the amount I put in my other stories. However, for what reason even I can't understand, this one has more of my interest than the others combined. I don't know why. So a few things to note. I apologize for not getting the information on how his boosted gear works accurately. I was given the impression it adds his base power over and over, but I was proven wrong and given information that it multiplies his collective potential with each boost. So rather than adding, say 10 plus 10 over and over, it's 10 plus 10 plus 100 plus 1000, and so on. It makes me realize that this power is overly bullshit. But then again, as Issei is a predator, it makes sense that it should be ridiculous. In regards to the predators, in a manner of speaking, they are more powerful than the Maos. Although it's debatable if they can stand up against super devils, seeing as their true forms exist beyond the conceptions and logic placed on the world. Therefore, as predators are recognized as the world's strongest, a super devil might be more powerful as they are not bound by the foundations of the world. Still, I have the discussion open for anyone as well as presenting it to those who work with me on my stories. In regards to Ludwig von Siegfried, second predator, I've no idea what I'm to do with him. He's more than likely not to make an appearance, much like any other predator. I understand there is a Siegfried in canon to this story, who is a descendant to the actual hero. So is mine, as he comes from the Siegfried clan. So I'll more than likely keep mine only in mention. Also, his Gram and Balmung aren't sacred gears but are more actual weapons he designed himself that surpass the originals. This is because of his gift of craft, something of the same origins as Issei's gift of flight in this story. Last, I've already broken my rule about OCs. Though this one only appears in this chapter and that'll be it. But I feel I've overstepped my bounds and let her dictate how the story will progress a little too much. I await everyone's response. I also ask if anyone is okay if I introduce at least one of the predators in the future. I wanted this to be a strictly DxD character only story, but am greatly tempted to see what would happen should one of them show up in Japan. Dragon X Delinquent, I know you and I are having a conversation on the moment. I apologize for not responding and will be getting to that when I can. Thank you everyone for your time, and I'm sorry if I'm not responding to any other PMs or reviews. My time is taken by work and other projects. Plus I was without internet for a few days. Enjoy. Nakashima Ayame was a little girl no older than 12. She was rather tall for her age and was often mistaken for a Patanko high schooler, especially with the bored yet sharp look in her eyes. She lived by herself in a moderately sized house once belonging to her parents and was now under the ownership of her aunt until she became of legal age. Day in and out, she would go to the grocer and purchase her dinner, always taking as much time as possible in the checkout to enjoy the conversation with the teenage boy she secretly had a crush on. At her free time, after she had meticulously cleaned every square inch of the house from her boredom, she would wander around the park in search of someone to play with. There were times when she could play with younger children, but most children her age were in school and she was left to play by herself most of the time. And the parents mistook her as some cradle robber and usually pulled their young children away from her. Her aunt rarely showed up, perhaps checking in on her once every week for only a few hours. Sometimes Ayame could convince her to stay for dinner, yet they would always eat in silence. Her aunt never liked her because of some falling out between her and Ayame's mother. Something about her mother stealing her aunt's boyfriend and Ayame being the result of that affair. No one would pay for her to attend school. Rather, her aunt went out of her way to make sure she wouldn't be going to school. Many times Ayame tried to retrieve help from the government to allow her free tuition into any school, but her aunt had been against it and resulted in harsh punishments. However, in order to avoid any legal issues, her aunt made her continue her education by filling out and submitting online essays and exams. Ayame thought many times about running away or reporting her aunt. She may have been young, but she wasn't stupid and knew well her aunt was misguiding her. However, she also thought about what would happen. She would more than likely be taken away to some foster home or orphanage since she had no other relatives to turn to. Ayame didn't want that. She wanted to stay in the home she was born in. But she so desperately wanted someone to talk to. She wanted a friend. Her mother had taught her to pray. For the past 3 years, Ayame had learned to talk to God, to act like he was beside her. She made a game of it and tried to think of what he looked like, what he dressed in, how he talked, how he would behave around her, and so on. But it was no different from an imaginary friend. No matter how long or how many times she talked to God, he never responded. And for 3 years her prayers for wanting a friend were ignored. Well then, fuck it. If God wouldn't listen, then she might as well try her luck with Lucifer. As one who had a lot of free time, she spent a few weeks searching online for authentic rituals and hexes for getting an audience with the devil. Right off the bat she knew more than 99% of them were just complete bullshit. But there was the 1% that caught her attention. It was on a blog from a local teenage girl who claimed it worked in summoning the high school prince as a devil. Normally she would have ignored the claim and moved on to the next resource if not for 2 things. First, the following day Ayame couldn't find the blog post no matter what she tried or how much she hacked into the system to retrieve the data. It was like it hadn't existed in the first place, a feat only a superb hacker could perform, but then raised the question why someone of that caliber would do it in the first place. The second was the intricacy of the magic sigil on the attached photo. It was the stereotypical magic circle most cults used. However, her eyes acknowledged the geometric pattern which was based off of the spiral theory. Shapes and lines overlapping another that looked like nonsense but to the mathematical mind was nothing short of genius. What appeared to be hoopla that was supposed to look fancy was, in fact, something far too abstract and complicated for some archaic nutjob to figure out on his own. This was something that would take months to draw out. It was a good thing she printed it out the day she found it. Now, she didn't know what she needed for a satanic ritual. Her information was still fresh and her investigation threw her all over the place. Some said to use black candles, others white, and there was also the question on which fragrances to purify yourself in. Then what to wear, what time of day to perform the ritual, what materials you use to draw the circle, whether one was a virgin or not, so on and so forth. She thought about using her aunt as a sacrifice. But then it'll become a problem if that annoying social worker showed up without her aunt being around. People would start looking into her sudden disappearance, especially at her job at the health clinic. Cleanup wouldn't have been a problem. She had plenty of time to take care of that. In the end, she found and bought a few chickens, drained them of their blood, and filled it in a spray can. She enlarged the printout and cut out a 4-piece stencil, taped everything down to the center of the living room, and then sprayed the summoning circle directly onto the wooden floor. She decided a plain white blouse would be acceptable for the ritual, lit a few white candles in 5 corners representing the pentagram, and gave a prayer to the circle. Naturally it didn't work. Of course it wouldn't. If God didn't answer, then why would Lucifer? Either she wasn't destined to have a friend, or she didn't do something right. Not really having anything better to do, she pulled her laptop and looked up alternative means to summon the devil. An hour or so after her search, the doorbell rang. It was such a strange and foreign sound to her. No one rings the doorbell. The social worker only calls at this point and her aunt just barges in with her spare key. Why? She couldn't recall a time when someone rang the doorbell, even when her parents were alive. She was conflicted between answering for the sake of a conversation or ignoring it for her health. It was late at night and no good ever comes in the evening. She should just pretend she was asleep. Eventually the person would leave. 3 minutes later the bell rang again. She ignored it. 5 minutes after that, it rang again. Clearly this person couldn't take a hint and leave her alone. If they weren't going to leave, then she might as well see what was so goddamn important. Issei was pretty sure he had the right address. It wouldn't be the first time he had gotten the location of the client wrong. But he learned from his mistakes, at the 3rd attempt. and had written down the addresses this time. He checked his note. It was accurate. He sent a message to Rias for confirmation and she replied with the matching address. After standing for almost 15 minutes, he scratched his head and pondered on what to do. He did get a little lost on his way over here and took longer than usual. There was also the little break-in at the family-owned bakery. He stopped halfway through here. Maybe he took too long and the client wasn't home? His suspicions were put to rest at the sound of approaching footsteps followed by the clicking of locks. He stood up straight and tried to make himself as presentable as possible. He also braced himself for the worst. He's had nothing but questionable clients so far. Yes. Oh, how he wanted to fall on his knees right then and there and sing hymns to the gods of debauchery. They weren't fucking with him this time, and they rewarded his patience with a cuadere patanko instead of some overly muscled cross-dressing magical man. Opening the door for him was a brown-haired beauty with silver eyes with European features. She was close to his age, maybe a year younger than him, and almost as tall. She was dressed in a spaghetti-strap white dress that fell to her knees. Issei's level 87 X-ray eyes told him she wasn't wearing a bra. She stared at him with such expressionless eyes Issei could get lost in her gaze forever and ever. However, if there's anything he's learned from his misadventures of being a pervert, fate was a woman. As a pervert, he was the bane of every woman, and thus fate's. Therefore, it wouldn't be uncommon for fate to defy the laws she placed on the world itself just to make his life as miserable as possible. This girl could just be answering the door for some darker monstrosity inside. Issei didn't want to think what could have been worse than his most recent client. Hi? He nervously started out with. She stared at him with those piercing eyes. The hell with Akino's sexual harassment with the way she undressed him. This girl was digging in deeper. Hi. Would there by chance be anyone else home? Again, she stared at him. He was beginning to grow uncomfortable. If you're asking if I'm home alone, I'm not. Can I help you with something? I'm expecting someone soon. Issei perked up at this. Oh, were you the one by chance who called me? Her brow arched. Not in surprise, but as a gesture as to show she was openly questioning his intelligence. He knew he wasn't the brightest student. He didn't need some stranger to remind him. Are you trying to tell me you're the devil? Her brows came together in agitation and skepticism. She eyed him up and down, undressing him so masterfully it brought his optic undressing skill to shame. You're a disappointment. You're nothing like the high school prince the blog posted about. A metaphorical arrow pierced Issei. That would be Kiba. Issei was able to brush it off a bit better this time. This wouldn't be the first someone tried to summon Yuto and got him instead. As a new devil, he had started off with getting everyone's extra summons. But this would be the first time someone called me personally. So, here I am. Once again, Issei had his intelligence put into question with the look she was giving him. What devil rings the doorbell? She dryly asked. Give me a break. He half demanded and cried. I've been a devil for barely 2 weeks and still learning how things work. I've spent one handing out flyers every night and only recently got the okay to visit potential clients. For some reason I'm not compatible with the summoning circle. Bucko says I can't produce enough demonic energy to slip through. So you're a noob, she deadpanned. But then she opened the door a little wider. Come in. I'll make us some tea. Issei blinked but was moving inside anyways. Just like that? No asking for me to reveal my powers or anything like that? She shut the door and escorted him down the hallway towards the living room. I knew what you were right away. I was only wondering why you were ringing the doorbell. Issei nearly tripped. Bucko did tell him humans with strong enough greed could identify a devil. The whole conversation could have been prevented. Instead she chose to insult him while rubbing salt in his still fresh wounds. What a cruel, cruel girl. But at least she was cute. If she was cute then he didn't mind if she was a little mean. She did strike him as the type to completely walk all over him. And his recent escapades, beat downs, with Kaneko made him learn of the wonders of femdom. Granted it was the school mascot just assaulting him for being within 3 meters near her. For some reason, it was far different from the normal beatings he received when he got caught peeping by the girls of the academy. If he played his cards right, maybe this girl will be a bit more gentle. Issei did, however, trip as soon as he saw the magic circle in the middle of the room. The blood was still a little wet and the smell was intoxicating his senses. What the hell is this? Over in the kitchen, which had a barstool window for anyone to peer in from the living room. The girl placed a kennel on the stove. She looked up in curiosity as though there was nothing wrong and wanted to know why he was freaking out. "The magic circle I found to summon you. Did I not perform the ritual right? Was I supposed to use human blood after all?" This time, Issei was the one giving her the look of questioning her intelligence. But it had no effect on her as her returning gaze felt like a brick to the face. No, we don't use blood, in fact." He approached the bar and pulled out one of the leaflets from his pocket. It was one of the many flyers Rias made him hand out to the public and slip inside mailboxes for 10 days straight. On the front was the magic circle for Rias Gremory's peerage. He handed it to her and explained while she looked it over, "You can just use that. There are instructions on the back as well as a survey." She flipped it over and read said instructions. Her bored and dry expression changed suddenly to one of disbelief and astonishment. Not good astonishment. It was another means for her to question the competence of what Issei had to offer. He didn't understand what her problem was. The instructions were simple. 1. Hold on to the tag with the magic circle facing up. 2. Make a wish. 3. Wait for your devil to appear. How can it be any more difficult than that? Simple is best, right? But the glare she gave him didn't make him feel like a monkey this time. The one she gave him was leagues more brutal than the ones before. It made him feel like a single-celled amoeba. "No, wait. That's not the problem." Issei snapped out of his disparity, or chose to ignore it for the sake of his manhood. "We need to clean this up before someone sees it." Already his head swiveled around in search of something to use to help him. His eyes saw a rather tall cupboard in the kitchen, so he circled around the counter and looked through there. Just as he suspected, most of the cleaning products were neatly organized within. He pulled out the mop, a bucket, and some soap. "Use the clear bottle with the yellow cap," the girl said after watching him move. "It'll clean up blood better than the wood cleaner you grabbed." Clear bottle, yellow cap. Issei put down the bottle he first grabbed and exchanged it with the one she recommended. It looked to be some homemade formula seeing as the bottle didn't have anything on it while the liquid inside was as clear as alcohol. It also stank something fierce because of his heightened senses, even with the cap firmly on. He turned and dared to ask with some hesitation, "Exactly what is this?" "Universal cleaner," was her reply. "I see," he gulped after waiting for her to explain further but getting nothing. With that, he filled the bucket with water and mixed it in with some of the unknown cleaning product and went to work. All the while, she watched him from behind the stove until the kennel started to steam. Expertly, she moved around the kitchen and pulled out what was needed to finish the tea without having to take her eyes off of him. It was starting to become creepy. 10 minutes later, the tea was served in fine china with a few assortments of other sweets for picking. As one who had to clean the entire house on his own for 3 years, Issei could take pride in his skills in removing stains. It wasn't something he enjoyed, but it's not like he could have hired help. Well, he could have, but he wasn't so sure what to do if they somehow stumbled upon what was under his basement. He was both amazed and terrified of the girl's mystery cleaner. The blood practically dissolved at the touch. Just in case, he made sure to not directly touch it. "Thank you for the tea," he said politely as he took his first sip. He wasn't a tea expert, so he wasn't sure what kind it was. Nonetheless, it was fruity with a bit of lemon. It was quite nice. "You're welcome," she replied almost mechanically as she sat on the couch directly in front of his. She didn't touch her tea but instead continued to stare at him intensely. There was an awkward silence between the two for some time that was growing worse with each tick of the clock hanging over the kitchen. At least to Issei it was. He couldn't tell what this girl was thinking with her face frozen in the same dull expression. It was so potent he almost couldn't keep his focus on her exposed panties. Almost. She wasn't that different from Kaneko, yet at the same time the two were obviously two different people. While Kaneko hated his existence with every fiber of her being and sent all kinds of subliminal messages of death whenever he was around, this girl was staring at him in a quizzical manner. She was observing him, studying him, recording his every action and analyzing the smallest of his movements. Actually, as he thought about it, Kaneko did the exact same thing. But there was a difference between the two. Kaneko stared at him as though he were her ultimate enemy and so observed and made note of his weaknesses in order to wait for the perfect moment to strike. This girl was studying him as though he was a new scientific discovery, which wasn't too far from the truth. "So, Issei placed his cup down and scratched his cheek. The girl's eyes sharpened at his words. How about some introductions? My name is Hyodo Issei, a local high school student turned devil, and pawn of Rias Gremory. It's nice to meet you, he finished with a small bow. Nakashima Ayame, she responded and gave a similar bow, and then resumed to stare at him. Issei was starting to sweat. He's had some weird clients, but at least they were all conversational. So, Nakashima-chan. What can I do for you? As a devil I'm here to grant a wish so long as you can afford it. I can grant you money and power, and even turn you into a magical girl. But I strongly advise not going for stuff like that. Her brow arched at the mentioning of a magical girl. Funny story that was. One of Issei's first clients was a full-grown man who desperately wanted to be a magical girl. Dressed up like one and everything. They ended up just watching a bunch of magical girl anime and discussing it over like a pair of otakus. He was a repeat customer, unfortunately. You seem useless for a devil, she stated as though it were the most obvious of things. It made him flinch in pain. But I do have a wish I think someone like you can grant. I'm willing to trade my soul for it. For the first time, she looked away. I would like a friend. But then her razor-sharp gaze went back to him. I'm even willing to accept a lolicon like you. Though I would have preferred that so-called prince, I've learned to not be picky. Instead of flinching, Issei retched forward. I am not a lolicon. Sure, I may be a pervert, and may be willingly serving as a devil to gain my own peerage to one day build a harem. But a lolicon? What makes you think that? He thought by now he could null out that look that put his intelligence into question. Unfortunately he couldn't. He was rendered back into a single-celled amoeba. Because you've been staring at my panties this whole time. His jaw dropped. Impossible. Issei had his observational skills high enough to use nothing but his peripheral vision to see just as clearly as if he was looking directly. It was how he was able to look at Sona's, Buckow's, and Akino's panties when they sat in front of him without them noticing. Unless, somehow, they did know but didn't say anything. Bucko never seemed to mind and continued to believe it was all a mask he put up. Akino preferred to tease him. And Sona had stopped scolding him months ago. Which meant though his observational skills were high enough, it didn't mean his discretion skills were on par. Wait. That wasn't important right now. What she had just said was far more important. Nakashima-chan, sweat started to roll down Issei. Ayame, she insisted. Alright. Ayame-chan, exactly, how old are you? I just turned 12 2 months ago, she stated as though she were giving a casual comment about the weather. Issei fell off the couch and hunched over all four limbs. This whole time he was undressing her in his mind's eye, trying to figure out her measurements, fantasizing about potential situations they could find themselves in during this visit, and had been staring at her panties. Dear God, ow. He could go to prison just for imagining these things. Even though he knew he was going to hell once he died, there was going to be a special place for someone like him. I had assumed you already knew this. She tilted her head ever so slightly with her brows scrunching a fracture. Everything about you screamed virgin, so I assumed you were fine with a young girl. Not that I mind. Since I'm already giving you my soul, I see it as already giving you my everything. Issei nearly flipped the coffee table between them in his recovery. Now wait just a minute. We don't trade in souls. And something like your virginity isn't something you just willingly give away to anybody. You should give it to someone special. You say that, but you're perfectly fine with me having yours, she said so matter-of-factly as though the words had no weight to them at all. But they were crushing Issei. I'm not a lolicon. Would it have made a difference if I lied and told you I was 14? Issei stopped fooling around and reseated himself onto the couch. He gave a sigh as he directed his attention at Ayame, who was staring at him the same way as before. But a brow of hers twitched when he didn't falter this time. No, I'd have to say it wouldn't. I mean by what I said. Something like that isn't something you should just give away. If you were honest about giving it to me, then I thank you. But we don't know each other. Something like that should be more special. She blinked a few times before looking away. Her head tilted in contemplation on where to proceed with the conversation. I've nothing else to offer you, Issei-chan. Those are the only things I can say are mine. I summoned a devil with the intentions of giving up everything, but you won't accept them. I don't know what else to do. His heart went to this girl. The house was far too quiet, even in the dead of night. There was a state of silence echoing through the walls Issei was more familiar with than anyone. He should have picked up the signs quicker. First, the silence. Second, her fib about someone else being home. Third, her lack of social etiquette. And fourth, the distant look in her eyes that screamed boredom. She was just like him. Alone. He gave her a warm smile. Ayame-chan, you don't need to offer me anything. I couldn't possibly be a friend if my friendship could be bought. So if you want a friend, I'll be that friend. No strings attached. Her head turned back towards him. Those silver eyes bore into his and he didn't flinch this time. In fact, he welcomed her. He opened himself to her for her to peer into his being. Slowly, he watched as that frozen face began to melt away as she uncovered the similar signs she wore. Her face relaxed, her brows rose, and her eyes widened. In this silent moment of clarity, she recognized him as someone in the same situation as she was. And in the next moment, as Issei couldn't figure out how this happened, she was sitting on his lap as they were watching TV together. Neither one said a word as they watched some cartoons. While she might have been perfectly fine with the situation, Issei was battling with his confusion. He had to constantly remind himself that she was 12 despite her looking like a first year. It didn't help that out of the blue she looked up and asked, "So when will you take my virginity?" "I told you I'm not a lolicon." And so began a strange relationship between two individuals who had only themselves as company, who had met another through unnatural means, and had found a companionship between them. From this day onward, Issei would visit Ayame whenever she called for him, sometimes handing extra clients to his other teammates on nights she and another demanded his appearance. Though he had been able to get contracts with each of his clients, Ayame was the only one he refused to make a deal with. Rias had gotten upset with him, but seeing as he always got a good review from her and had been able to make pacts with everyone else, she couldn't criticize him. Scene * days later, eyes. There you are. Rias stood up from her desk as soon as her pawn arrived. He was the last to show up. As expected, Kaneko glared daggers at Issei the moment he stepped through the door. It didn't stop her from eating her sweets though. She honestly wished the two could get alone. Issei had no problems with her and often tried to be on good terms with her, but the Nekomata wanted nothing to do with him. At first all she did was throw insults and hide behind someone when he appeared. But then it grew worse to where she started throwing things at him, stomped on him just for talking to her, and one time threw him out the window. Rias had enough and scolded her for her unruly behavior. Kaneko stopped harassing Issei, but it didn't stop her from being cold to him. When asked her reasons to be so against the pawn, Kaneko couldn't provide an adequate reason. Even Kaneko didn't seem to know and stated it was more out of instinct than consciousness. Eventually, after much thought, Kaneko came up with something. A hunter, was her answer. Rias didn't know what to make of it and Kaneko didn't know how to elaborate any further. Issei was nothing but a good kid. Perverted beyond any means of attempting to understand. Yes, but a good kid with good morals. It's not like he would sexually assault any of the girls of the academy. He only went as far as to peep on them from a safe distance. Besides, even if he was given the chance to do anything with a girl, he would do everything in his power to go against it. If anything, Issei was more of a coward. There was nothing about him that struck her as the hunter type. But then again, there was the question on what he did on nights he requested, evenings off or on days he didn't show up to school. He would show up to the clubroom either exhausted or covered with a few bandages. And then there was the strange warning from Sona, about how he was a force too powerful for Rias to be able to control. "Good evening, bucko," Issei greeted with his usual smile. "Akeno wanisama. Kiba. Kone. Bite me." The Nekomata responded out of habit. And in the next blink of an eye, Issei was crying in the corner with his back to everyone. The habitual exchange partook almost every day and made Rias think twice about him being any kind of hunter. "Issei, focus." Rias clapped her hands to get his attention. "This is important. The Archduke has sent us a warning about a rogue devil entering our territory. We've been able to track its location so we're moving out this moment to take care of it. This is serious so I need you to be ready." Issei raised his hand and asked a question as though he were still in class. "What exactly is a rogue devil?" Akeno answered with her delightful smile. "Stray devils are those who abandon their masters and wander around of their own volition. This one, however, killed her former king and began to eat humans as a way to grow stronger. But she couldn't control the power she gathered and went mad. I believe she should be a deformed beast at this point." It always irked Issei on how she could be so cheerful even about the darkest of things. Eyes, Rias began again, I've marked the location on your device. Since you still can't produce enough demonic energy to travel through the magic circle, I'm afraid you're going to have to get there on your own. But we'll be waiting for you. There's something I need you to see. Issei pulled out the GPS device he had been using since the days he delivered flyers to mailboxes. True to her words, a red blip blinked on the screen. But he groaned when he saw the location being on the opposite side of town, past the rural area and over the hills. Yes, bucko, he gave a heavy sigh and let a single tear fall as he stood up. He had a lot of pedaling to do. Seen even on a bicycle, it should have taken a normal person slightly less than an hour to cross the grand distance of the city to their isolated location. It was when Rias was finishing her briefing on strategy with her pieces did she hear the roaring from the distance. The other sign came from Akano, who gave her usual mischievous laughter and made a mention of something over the horizon. And then there was the tensing of Kaneko as she decided to use Yuto as a shield. Gu www.00000HHHH. Rias nearly tripped where she stood when she saw her pawn on his bicycle coming from the hills. A trail of dust followed him. She watched as his form was blurred by both his speed and the winds he was generating. From the horizon, approximately 6 to 7 miles away from the top of the first hill, Issei had just covered the distance in less than 2 minutes. It meant he had been cycling at least 40 miles per hour. Via bicycle. At the appropriate distance, he slid sideways and leaned against his direction to have his bike screech to a halt. Expertly, almost masterfully, he had been able to stop right in front of the group. And there wasn't a bead of sweat on him. Sorry for being so late, bucko. He gave a sheepish smile as he got off his bike, which had been totaled by the strain of his abilities. I got here as soon as I could. Foo, cackled Akano behind a hand. An interesting one indeed. Rias quickly shook off her surprise. She shouldn't be surprised to begin with. It was possible for devils to perform similar tasks since their bodies were far more durable than a human's. And Issei was a character who had proven capable of battling against fallen angels. So seeing something like this shouldn't come as a shock. But, as she did the math in her head, he had somehow been able to cross 30 miles in less than 5 minutes. Which meant in those last 2 minutes he had slowed down to assist his braking. And if she was doing her math right, which she hoped was wrong, it meant Issei was breaking the sound barrier to get here. Via his bicycle, she wondered if the magic concealing his devil activities were strong enough to cancel out the sound and damages wrought by a sonic boom. Don't worry about it, she told herself to not ask any questions until he was ready to reveal something. She told herself to be patient, but the limits she set on herself were starting to come down. But I do have to ask, if you got here so fast, why can't you be this fast getting to your clients? Issei answered honestly, because I can't afford to buy a new bike every time. And I figured this was an emergency with the way Akano Wanisama said this stray devil ate people. I can't allow a chance for it to slip away and bring more harm to others. She nodded at that answer. Very well, now that you're here we can begin the operation. I've already informed everyone else about the strategy. Seeing as you're new, I'm going to have you on standby to watch and observe how we do things. Are you ready? Yes, bucko, Issei responded with his perverted and goofy personality gone. His eyes were sharp with resolve. But I insist if things go out of control to allow me to step in. I don't want this thing escaping and hunt more people if given the chance. Rias gave a proud smile. If it will make my adorable pawn happy, then I'll allow it. But I assure you it won't be needed. None of us are pushovers. Just watch and see. Seeing the stray devil was exactly what he had imagined. A corrupted being so tainted in evil vices to have its body morphed to match its soul. It was the upper torso of a beautiful woman, with nice breasts, but had the lower half convoluted into a cross between a horse and a reptile. She may have had the appearance of a human and may have mimicked one's behavior, but all manner of intelligence was gone from this creature and replaced with primal madness, fitting that of a gluttonous beast. The threat level from this creature was too high for Issei to ignore. He might not be as sensitive to the vices of others like some of his senpai, especially the divine beast, but he could still sense the quality of sin this once devil had brought in her greed for power. He could smell the amount of blood soaking through her skin that will never go away with the amount of innocent death she delivered. And rendered to nothing but a carnivorous beast, she will continue in her quest for more power until she explodes or mutates into something beyond recognition. If left alone, Issei will have to step in as eighth predator. However, he listened to his king's orders and watched as she explained the roles of each member of her peerage. Kiba Yuto, her knight, danced around the stray devil visor with a sword manifesting in his hand out of nowhere. His augment through the knight piece granted him enhanced speed. Taju Kaneko, her rook, was able to deliver powerful blows with a punch or kick strong enough to throw visor around like a doll. Her augment through the rook piece granted her extreme strength and defense. Rias took the time to define the other piece, the bishop. She claimed due to certain circumstances she couldn't have direct access to her current bishop. But she explained the perk of the bishop granted the devil extended supplies of demonic energies. And then, there was the queen, Hamejima Akeno. As queen, she had the perks of all the pieces put together. Enhanced speed, strength, defense, and a surplus in demonic energy reserves. Akeno flew through the air, high enough to touch the ceiling. She raised her hand. A series of sparks lit up the dark room as lightning surged between her fingertips. At the sound of cackling electricity, Yuto and Kaneko leapt away from visor. The stray devil, weakened enough to be dazed and confused, had no idea what was going to happen next. Akeno unleashed a fierce bolt of lightning from her hand down onto the stray devil like an angry god punishing a sinner. But Issei frowned as he saw the durability of the stray devil had been able to resist enough lightning to keep her alive. Badly burnt, sure, but still alive. It was enough for her to move freely once the shock went away. It took Issei a moment to realize this was intentional. Rias acted like nothing was wrong, even smirked at her queen's behavior. But after the third mediocre lightning bolt zapping visor, Issei realized what was going on. Akeno was a sadist. The queen laughed in delight as she continued to hold back just enough to make sure the stray devil was screaming in agony. Just enough to where visor wouldn't pass out or succumb to her wounds. A heavy blush coated her face as she was using her free hand to lick her fingers. She wasn't just enjoying it, she was getting turned on by it. Now, Issei's seen his fair share of BDSM over the years. As the greatest pervert to have ever lived in the entirety of history, he didn't mind sadism. Lately he's grown an appreciation for things like femdom due to the abuse he's received from Kaneko. He also enjoyed Akeno's teasing just to see him uncomfortable. But, as a pervert, he's been forced to acknowledge the difference between fantasy and reality. Sadism in porn was far different than sadism in the real world. In the real world, right at this moment, there was one person who was enjoying seeing another person scream in pain and begging for mercy. Someone who was having their skin burnt from the inside, having their nerves fried, releasing their lower bowels from such nerve damage, and having nothing but pain tear apart their minds. And on the other end was a girl, safe and sound at a distance, not just enjoying the face the victim was making, but was enjoying the fact that she was the one doing the harm. He had seen that sickening smile before. That smile that took perverse delight in the most atrocious of acts for their own amusement. His mind blanked out as the memory forced its way through. He tried to fight it, tried to push it back down. He bit his lip to try to have the pain distract him, but it didn't save him. Well, facelifts costs like $5,000 so, the man pulled at his own face as if it didn't fit him right. Issei realized it wasn't a face. It was a mask made out of human skin, still fresh with the blood dripping down his chin. And the mask smiled at him, though a smile he had known his entire life. That of his father's. This was a mask made out of his father's face. See anything you like. Explosion. Issei snapped. His body launched forward with the collective potential he had been building up from observing the battle. He was nothing but a blur as he crossed the distance in a blink. An eruption of gravel and marble from the floor and pillars went everywhere, forcing everyone to cover themselves. But with a mild wind spell, Akeno was able to sweep away the cloud of dust threatening to choke everyone. It was then she saw what remained of her latest victim. Issei was lowering his stance after delivering a fatal blow. His feet had created 2 small craters into the ground by the amount of rebound force driven in his attack. He had also carelessly thrown himself in front of Akeno's attack and so had his left shoulder scorched. Through the hole in his clothes, they could make out the corner tracing of neon fluorescent markings breathing as he did. But it wasn't important at the moment. Visor the stray devil was, without any reason of doubt, dead. Issei had used the most basic of the assaulter stance to deliver a forward punch directly onto Visor's abdomen. The amount of power he put behind the punch had her body explode into several chunks. Hardly anything of her was recognizable, with most her chunks hanging over the stair railway and walls. Even her head had been crushed as it was left in a dent in the wall. Like a swordsman, Issei extended his fingers and flicked his arm downward fast enough for most of the blood and guts to fly off. He did not say anything as his face was contorted with both rage and sorrow. He did not look at anyone either as he continued to stare off into space. "If that is all," he said without any emotion, "I'll be leaving for the evening." He didn't say anything else, nor did he dare to look at any of his teammates. He especially refused to look at Himejima's direction. At the moment, he couldn't stand the sight of her. Rias was calling his name, but he chose at the moment to ignore her. He'll have to apologize to her when he can. But right now, he needed to get home. The wall he had built for his memories had come down and they were starting to warp his thoughts. He didn't want to see what will happen if he stuck around much longer. "Kaneko!" He heard Yuto cry in alarm. With a quick glance, he saw the blonde handsome catch the school idol as her knees gave in. Her face was flushed and she was panting. Her eyes were absolutely absorbed by Issei. When their eyes met, her flush intensified. Regardless, her moment got everyone's attention. When Rias looked away to see what the alarm was about, it gave Issei a chance to slip away. As soon as he stepped outside, he activated his gift of flight and disappeared, not caring if Kaneko saw his draconian wings alight or not. Scene: "Hey, what are you doing today?" Ayame made sure that the sun was up. And so it was. She had wondered who in the world was demanding her presence so early in the morning. She had answered the door in nothing but her nightgown, nightcap, and red blur plushie tucked in her arms, and never expected Issei of all people to be there. True, she had tried to summon him last night, but she had received a message via carrier bat. Is that supposed to be the devil equivalent of carrier pigeon? Saying they couldn't accept requests that night. Yet here Issei was. He apparently didn't get his own company's memo and was late, 12 hours late, at that. But someone as sharp as Ayame could tell there was something wrong with Issei. As the sole resource of her communication, she had absorbed every detail of him. Oh, he still had that stupid grin on his face that warranted her to call the police on this pedophile. But the angle was slightly stretched. She reasoned he was forcing himself to smile and was succeeding only through muscle memory. He was very good at fooling others. But to someone who had monitored his every action down to the last detail could tell something was wrong. However, that didn't stop her from giving him her trademark, "Are you an idiot?" stare at his question. "What are you doing today? Seriously. Does she ever do anything?" She sighed and opened the door a little wider. "Come in and wait for me to get dressed. I'll call the police if I catch you peeping." "I'll just wait for you in the living room," he stated with a nervous laugh and a scratch to his cheek. She let a frown slip. Not a good sign if he wasn't going to argue with her about being a lolicon. She usually looked forward to that. She enjoyed watching him react like an exaggerated drama character whenever she teased him about taking her virginity. It never failed to get him riled up either. But today, he obviously wasn't himself. With a shrug, seeing as she had little to no experience in dealing with people to begin with, she left him alone to prepare herself for the day. She had been up late at night watching the rerun special marathon of her favorite anime and would have loved a few more hours of sleep. But Issei was her only friend, no matter how much she would have preferred the high school prince. He always came whenever she called, so why shouldn't she do the same? Even if it is such a burden. Half an hour later, she chose to step out of her room in a common blue shirt underneath her red blur sweatshirt and thigh shorts with white knee socks. The red blur sweatshirt was one size too big, as it was supposed to be for boys, and contained the hero's red scale armor design, the hood coming with a mask with green screens for eyes, and the obscure spinal tail found at the back of the neck which flowed down to her tailbone. It was her absolute favorite and wore it on days she felt lazy and wanted to just watch TV. She also chose it because she wanted to see Issei react in his normal cartoonish way. The sweatshirt made the impression that she wasn't wearing anything underneath with the way it covered her shorts as well. No doubt he would flip and go on some inner monologue with himself on whether he should say something against her or admire her appearance a little longer at the cost of being called a pedophile. Unfortunately, and this time it made Ayame worry, Issei gave no such reaction. He saw her coming down the hallway and ushered her towards the dining table. Of course his eyes flickered to what she was wearing, but he didn't freak out like she wanted him to. He just kept smiling and served breakfast. An angry tick mark appeared on Ayame's brow. The stupid lolicon was, for once, competent. He was considerate of her attire and chose to not ogle her, was going along with her usual insults, and was going as far as to make sure to prepare a delicious and nutritious breakfast? Ayame took the first bite of the grilled fish. Her chopsticks lingered by her lips as she absorbed the taste. As sharp as her eyes, her tongue acknowledged the amount of tender care put in preparation. Another angry tick mark appeared. Ah, Issei scratched the back of his head. Sorry for using your kitchen and your ingredients. I wasn't sure if you had breakfast yet, so I thought I should at least do this for you. Don't worry, I'll clean up all the dishes and later today repurchase the ingredients I used. A third tick mark appeared. Breakfast was eaten in silence for a few minutes. A fourth tick mark appeared when he didn't react to her staring like he normally did. He didn't falter or try to start a conversation to distract her. Instead, he ate away and welcomed her staring. With a smile, he mentioned, "This is nice, enjoying breakfast with someone. Don't you think so, Ayame-chan?" When the fifth tick mark appeared, she was the one to flip. "Scene, I see," Ayame said during lunch at a cafe. It took several hours and a few activities for Issei to finally get over his depression to open up to Ayame. Even after she had thrown every dish at his face and demanded to know what was wrong with him, he didn't say anything other than that he was going to clean up her mess. He even had the audacity to serve her a second serving of breakfast. For most of the morning, he had used her as a distraction to escape what turmoil he was running away from. They had caught an early discount movie, played games at the arcade, shopped through the clothing district, and then finally decided to grab some food at a local cafe. No matter how many times she jested about this being a date with an underage girl, Issei never bickered back. She wanted to enjoy this as this was her first time doing anything with an actual friend in her entire life, but the gap between them was keeping her from doing so. She took everything about wanting the high school prince back. She just wanted her old friend. Pedophilia and all with it. Eventually he told her what was wrong and apologized for using her as a distraction. He told her about the stray devil incident and what he was forced to do to stop it from escalating any further. And now, he was ditching school because he wasn't sure how he was going to confront his fellow devils at the Occult Research Club. Eventually he'll have to report back to them, but he wasn't sure what to say to them. He liked each of them personally, even that horrendously abusive Kaneko girl, but he wasn't sure if he could trust any of them if they were all okay with Akino's sadistic personality. Ayame didn't miss his mentioning of killing this stray devil. Ayame wasn't so innocent as to be unaware of what death meant, as she had watched that fat thing wear her father's face like a mask and murder her mother before her eyes. And secretly she wished for revenge against the culprit. But to be able to kill? Ayame wasn't so sure of that. Yet Issei had openly admitted to have killed. It showed on his face how much of a burden it was to him. "So you're running away like a bitch?" She shoved her words at him like a rusty blade to the chest. Let it be known, just because she had read up on psychology enough to understand the way people thought did not mean she knew how to treat and comfort them. "Yeah," Issei sighed in defeat. "Ha," Ayame mused. So this was what it felt like when the roles were reversed. Usually Issei did all the talking while she gave short responses. It was a wonder why he didn't get annoyed. She already was, and this was just the first response after telling his story. She ate a strawberry from her fruit parfait before going on. "You can't avoid them forever, Ise-chan. If you don't go into work, they'll eventually come for you." He gave another sigh while playing with his fries with a fork. "Yeah, I know that. I'm still debating whether I should go in tonight or not. I still have my responsibilities as a devil and will have clients calling me. I shouldn't ignore them, it wouldn't be fair." She thought about cracking a joke about him being a call girl, but it would have the same effect as the other 100 remarks today. That is to say, nothing. Right now, she was more angry with herself than with him at this point. For all that reading she's done in her moments of isolation, she had no idea how to get Issei out of this rut. She had always fantasized what to say during moments like these when she would finally achieve a friend. And here Issei was, the friend she wished for, and had been lost in what to do. It made her realize that no matter how much she observed him, she had only seen his positive side. She only saw what he allowed her to see. Now that his usual friendly mask was gone, she was clueless on who the individual sitting across of her was. No matter what, this was Hyodo Issei, her friend. "Let's go have fun," she said before munching on a peach this time. Chewing, swallowing, she continued, "Real fun this time. not that sorry excuse you tried to pull earlier." 20 minutes later, they were shut off from the world as they had rented out a karaoke room for the next hour. They ordered a few sodas and snacks while they sang songs together. Let it be known Hyodo Issei is not a singer, and he only chose opening songs from anime shows. Well, it wasn't like Ayame was any better as she couldn't put much feeling in her singing and chose only the top 20 songs on the popularity charts. If she could combine her voice with Issei's enthusiasm, it was believed they could create something magical. But when they tried the duet, 2 hours after that fiasco, they found themselves back in the shopping district. This time checking out the clothing and merchandise rather than brooding about. She managed to convince him to go clothes shopping with her as well as waiting for her in the dressing room as she tried each one on and presented her choices to him. It was but one of those things she fantasized about, except she expected her friend in her fantasies to be a girl. But Issei, being the pervert that he is included, will have to do. Only, he didn't react in his perverted manner. In fact, he just openly stated which clothes were cute on her or what clothes would have gone better with a certain article. She was quickly getting annoyed at how the pedophile wasn't reacting the way she wanted him to. Yes, she was 12, but she was still a girl and would like to know she had at least some appeal to her. So she suddenly just presented herself in her underwear. Finally he flipped, shoved her back into the room, and told her to get dressed. But he found himself in a situation to where someone would spot him coming out of a woman's changing room and there would definitely be problems. So he was forced to turn his back to her and let her get dressed with him in the room. She let a smile slip. Her friend was coming back to her. "Oh yeah," Issei spoke up while they were in an otaku shop. "Ayame-chan, about that sweatshirt. Did it seriously take him this long for him to finally figure out what she was wearing? 5 hours and he's barely about to say something about it?" "I am wearing something underneath, you lolicon," she blurted while scanning the latest releases of DVDs. No, not that." Issei made a quick look around to make sure no one else had heard her comment. He was finally starting to come back to his usual self. Ayame felt relieved. "I was going to ask." But she cut him off with an audible gasp. Her eyes widened as she spotted the object she had desired for so long. Some schmuck must have misplaced it into the new releases shelf. If this were in its preferred spot, then someone, like her, looking for it through every shop would have swiped it immediately. Was it by sheer luck, that through someone's mistake, that it was here before her? It was the special edition of Dragon Knight Heroes with a special disc featuring their movie. It covered all 3 seasons, provided director and voice actor commentary on each episode, and gave a teaser episode featuring the soon-to-be-revealed Black Dragon Knight. There was less than 100 of this box set produced and hardcore fans of the series had fought a bloody war to get their hands on this. And yet, somehow, it was untouched in this run-down no-name otaku shop. And it came with a red blur phone strap. Shoving Issei aside, she ran immediately to the counter while holding on to her precious treasure tucked into her arms. She was going to bite off the head of anyone who dared to get in her way. Luckily she didn't need to as she safely got to the clerk. Only to find the box set was more expensive than she realized. She was a fool to not have checked the price. She had expunged in her allowance today and wasn't just going to be tight on food this week, but she was missing a few yen to afford the anime collection. Rather, even if she had the money, she wouldn't be able to feed herself until her aunt gave her more money the following week. Actually, starvation was a worthy price to pay for this. So she cursed herself for spending on unnecessary things like clothes and parfaits. Well, the impatient clerk was waiting for her to pay. She slumped in defeat. There was nothing she could do and was going to embarrass herself. "Here, I'll pay for that." Issei approached at her side and handed a debit card to the clerk. The clerk gave him a shrug and then accepted the payment. He then packed the box set into a bag and handed it to Issei, who then handed it to Ayame. And Ayame accepted it as though it were the Holy Grail itself. She cradled it in her arms in a firm yet tender hold. When they exited the shop, Ayame looked up at Issei with newfound glory radiating around his aura. She was seeing him as this truly magnificent being. "Issei, marry me." In response, Issei tripped on his feet and landed flat on his face. With the foolishness aside, and after rubbing the dirt off his chin, he addressed her again. "I wanted to ask you about that." He pointed in the divine treasure in her arms followed by her sweatshirt. "What? Where? How?" Not being able to put his question into words, he ended up scratching his head. She didn't know either what he wanted, so she decided to just elaborate on the basic information and see where that lead. Dragon Knight Heroes is an anime based off of the red blur incidents happening all over the world. Ever since they captured an image of him, Sunlight Studios produced an anime with the red blur being the main character. In later episodes they introduced his rival, White Chaser, as his archenemy. Most of the anime reproduces incidents the red blur has solved, but there is something of a story in there, somewhere. Most of it is about fighting monsters though. It's my absolute favorite, Issei-chan. She watched as the more she elaborated, the more his expression began to tense. His brows came together in confusion at first, then of astonishment, and then finally of horror. His jaw ended up dropping, sweat began to drip down his brow, and his eyes widened. Suddenly, his hands were squeezing her shoulders. Ayame-chan, we're going home right now and watching all of this. Even if it takes days. A curious brow was arched by this reaction. Well, no matter the reasons, she supposed she should be glad that her friend had the same interest as her. At last she could watch her favorite anime and discuss about it in long hours with someone other than the mirror or red plush and plush chaser. She nodded. Issei turned off his phone and removed the power cell in the devil GPS system so that no one would disturb him. No doubt Rias would be trying to get a hold of him. But this was far more important than his duties as a devil. This revolved around his responsibilities as eighth predator. He wondered for a moment if Sona knew about this. More than likely not, as she always told him what about him was reported on TV and what wasn't. But he wondered how she could have missed an anime about him. He didn't say anything as he let Ayame sit on his lap with red plush and plush chaser held tight in her arms as the two watched the entirety of the box set. He wasn't sure if he should be annoyed or humored about plush versions of him or the white blur. But he didn't say anything as he kept all of his attention focused on each episode. The story was garbage. Some nonsense about him coming from space to be the defender of humanity and other cliché stuff he's seen in hundreds of generic anime. But they had been able to capture a few other details, some of which were far too close for him to be comfortable. Ayame looked at him a few times, mostly when his grip on her tightened. Certain incidents, such as the forest fire in Germany caused by an angry spirit, had been right on the spot. He saved some of the villagers, created that trail of dirt to halt the fire's advance, and then battled the fire spirit directly to stop its rampage. The animators of the show not only had gotten a general aspect of his armor detail down, but had been able to reanimate the image of the fire spirit so well it was as though Issei was reliving that moment. Granted, the fight was much more flashier than the actual brawl due to entertainment purposes, but some of the attacks such as a beam of fire or creating of fire sprites were there. Issei didn't know what to make of it. Someone knew what was really going on. And out of 36 episodes, 20 of them he would say were more accurate than they were supposed to be. He'll have to ask Sona to look into it. Maybe even some of the other predators. At least one of them should know about this. What do you think, Issei-chan? Ayame asked after they finished the regular episodes. It was very late into the evening and they decided to cut off right there. They could watch the specials and the movie some other day. Issei lifted her off of him and tried to get the blood circulation back onto his legs. 9 hours of her sitting on his lap left his legs as dead as the night. Nothing compared to the Dragon Ball series, and a little too flashy for my taste. But I did like the situations he found himself in. Like against that sandstorm Ginny. That looked like a tough opponent. And indeed it was. That horrific moment took Issei forever to take down. Powered by the wishes of humanity, the Ginny was immortal and had the potential to become deathless. It took Issei 47 times of killing it to finally have it weak enough to suppress. He left it weakened for the local mages to seal it back into its prison, which they did thankfully. But Ayame-chan, Issei lifted up red plush and examined the stitch marks that made up the design of his balance breaker armor. What is it that you like about it so much? Why do you say it's your favorite? Ayame took a seat across of him on the opposite couch. She had long thought about what to say should the question arise. She just hesitated as she tried to calm down her excitement. The anime is absolute garbage. Issei's sweat dropped. He just couldn't understand this girl no matter how hard he tried. She continued, I only watch it because I admire the red blur. Since he arrived a few years ago, I've been watching the news a lot more and been trying to follow how the world works. At first I couldn't pay attention to it much until I got older, but I could at least notice something right away. He never killed anyone. She munched on some of the stale popcorn they made earlier as she chose her words carefully. In all the world there were muggers, rapists, murderers, warlords, slavers, all the evil in the world with the most heinous of individuals, and he never took any of their lives. A normal person would give in to hatred and execute them on the spot. Yet he never did. Whenever he appears, he is a force that cannot be defied. He's appeared in the middle of battle zones and stopped both sides from fighting. Without a doubt he has the power to kill everyone if he so chose. Yet he doesn't. He delivers criminals to the judgment of the law, no matter how big or small their wrongs might have been. And he is not prejudiced against any nation or race as he goes around the world saving everyone. But I always wonder why he's doing this. She looked away as she hugged Plush Chaser a little closer. He has the ability to know right from wrong, so he must be human, not some alien like the anime speculates or some animal. Yet someone as powerful as that doesn't need to go out of his way to save people. He has it in his rights to go against nations and rule over them, yet he doesn't. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Then I think, does he do it for the recognition? The fame? But he never sticks around long enough for any of that. His picture was taken by chance. He doesn't want people to know about him. But the news already does, yet he continues with his predetermined plan of anonymity. So he doesn't do it to be some renowned hero. She gave a small sigh as she leaned back against the couch. I think, he does it because he's trying to run away from something. Issei's eyes widened in pure shock. He tried to hide it, but Ayame had already caught it. She shrugged and went on. Why else would he try so hard to save everyone? No matter who they were. Why would he not care about the recognition and glory that came along with it? I think he's just trying to save people just for the sake of doing it. Because he feels that with the power he has to do something with it. It's what I would do. Would you like to meet him? Her eyes narrowed once more to question his intelligence. But they shifted into an expression of confusion when he returned her stare with a serious one of his own. Contemplating on his words, she shrugged. Yes. I would love to. He gave her a warm smile. You know, Ayame-chan, as a devil I can make that wish come true. Fortunately for you it's within my power, so the price won't be as steep as your life. Ayame snickered, actually snickered. If a useless lolicon like you could get him to come over, I'll not just give you my soul and virginity, I'll even start to call you Ai's-ni from now on, Oni-chan. Issei blushed heavily as her sweet tone struck a heartstring within him. That was foul play. She called him something that every pervert dreamed of being called. Oh, now I see, her dry tone returned. So you're not a lolicon. You're actually a siscon. I am no such thing. Issei denied, with a small trickle of blood dripping down his nose. Don't worry. Even if you are, you're still a lolicon since I'm still only 12. Regardless. Issei shouted to get back on track. If I can get you to meet him, would you be willing to sign a contract with me? I think if I got one from you bucko will forgive me for ditching tonight. So you'll use your little sister as a scapegoat? Oni-chan. You're so mean, sniff, she fake cried while making a gesture to wipe a non-existent tear from her eye. But yes, I'll make one with you, but. She looked away as she blushed. Issei didn't know why. I actually enjoy calling you my brother, she confessed. Can I keep doing it anyways? Issei stood once the pins and needles feelings died and his legs returned to full function. Only if you'll let me call you Ayane. Ayame was the one to flinch this time. Her face heated up and hid behind Plush Chaser. She didn't expect him to call her that and it really triggered something deep from within her. Issei started to head towards the door. It's very late. I'll be heading home. Good night, Ayane. Make sure to be near a TV tomorrow afternoon. Oh, and look out for this signal. With his back turned against her, he turned his torso just enough for her to see the side of his face. He gave her a bright smile and a thumbs up with his right hand. Scene asterisk as promised. Ayame stayed around the living room and kept the television on public channels. She kept the television volume loud enough to be able to be heard throughout the house when she was busy cleaning the other rooms and hallway. So far nothing important had happened that would warrant her attention. She had no idea what Ai's-ni was going on about. Around 4 in the afternoon, her house phone rang. No doubt that annoying social worker was trying to get a hold of her aunt again. She should have known by now it was best to try the evenings when her shift at the health clinic was over. Regardless, it wouldn't do well if Ayame wasn't home when the social worker called, so she picked up the phone. Nakashima residence. Ayane. Ai's-ni was on the other line. It was hard to hear him as his location was noisy from the wind. But it didn't sound like he was in traffic or anything like that. Just that he was in a windy area. Are you by a TV? Her eyes traced over towards the television that had been on all day. If only her glare could be transferred through the phone receiver. Yes, eyes knee. Good. I want you to flip through the news channels and see if you can find a bank heist. I think I spot a Channel 42 crew. Ayame did as she was told and flipped through the channels until she saw the heist going on near Shibuya. From the camera angle, the crew was several blocks away from the actual danger as the police were currently locked away in a gunfight against a few robbers. The officers were outgunned as they carried their handheld pistols while the robbers had assault rifles. Plus there were a few hostages from what Ayame could tell. Eventually the special task forces will arrive and solve everything. But there was still the possibility someone will lose a life. The robbers, a hostage, or an officer. Losing a life? Her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She recalled Issei's words last night. The one in Shibuya? That's the one. Watch carefully, Ayame. And with that, the line went dead. Issei had hung up. Curious more than anything, Ayame put the receiver back and went over towards the television. What in the world was Issei up to? Was he going to use his useless devil magic to make the bad guys go away? Seriously, it's not like he could just make the red blur appear out of nowhere. That would be retarded. Seen miles high above, far too high to gather anyone's attention, especially the news choppers hovering safely over the gunfight. Issei clicked off his cell phone while tucking it back safely into the inside pocket of his under armor. His wings continued to blaze by his command. His draconian green eyes sharpened as he willed his power to intensify his optic capabilities. Even at this distance, he could make out the smallest of details with utmost clarity. He had already scouted how many officers there were, the general layout of the building through his cell phone, and estimated how many burglars there were. He was forced to assume there was at least one away as a driver and another hidden somewhere else in cases of a breach. With a smile, he was going to give Ayame the best gift ever. Balance breaker. The power within his core surged through his veins. Red armor materialized out of nothing but his will and passion. By his command, he willed his potential to be multiplied in league tiers. Feeling the power flow through him like liquid hot metal, he tucked his body forward and flew directly to the ground. His wings blazed to kick his speed greater than freefall gravity. Before hitting the ground, he rolled and planted his feet downward. Impossibly, his landing did not create a crater or cause a massive explosion like it should have. He was over 600 pounds in this armor, yet his wings suppressed most of the force. But his landing did shake the ground, causing officers and assailants alike to wobble on their feet. It made his presentation and gravitas all that much more devastating. When he slowly stood back up to let the crowds absorb his appearance, there was a silence that he knew was spread throughout all of Japan. By the time people started to recover from their shock, the silence would spread to the entire world as the video feed would be leaked onto every media station in every country. The red blur wasn't just coming in to stop a robbery. He was making a presentation out of it. The assailants were the first to come to their senses. But as the pair in the front started to raise their guns, Issei had already moved. Before they could so much as think, his gauntlet claws gripped their faces as he crossed over 30 meters in an instant, and his inhuman strength flung them behind him. Their bodies flew outside, with the one on the right breaking through the glass window. They hit the ground hard, rolled, and slammed into the sides of police vehicles. There was the man behind the counter, believing himself safe behind the bulletproof glass as he was busy tucking banknotes into a few duffel bags. Or at least he was until the ground shook by Issei's arrival. The other man, more than likely the leader of the group, stood at the center of the room as he had been giving orders left and right to his men and hostages. He was the one who first came to his senses, faster than the other two, and was already pulling a hostage into his arms with a pistol to her head. The threat was nulled as Issei once again crossed the distance in a flash, crushing the gun into dust in his grip while breaking the man's arm to release the woman. She fell forward out of shock and the sudden jerk caused by the assailant, but Issei had the chance to catch her. While dealing with her, he lifted his boot up to the man's abdomen and kicked him towards the counter. The glass rattled with the first layer cracking upon collision. His body fell to the floor, no doubt unconscious. But Issei wouldn't dare endanger the lives of anyone else if he wasn't, and chose to get back up should Issei be distracted. So, like the others, he flung him out the window for the officers to take care of. That left the fourth man behind the glass wall who was shitting bricks in fear. He had his back pressed against the far wall and gave a nervous laugh as his mind was telling him he was safe. That there was no way Issei could cross through the barrier. Oh, how wrong he was. Issei leapt forward, shattering through the reinforced glass barrier as though it were nothing but a screen door. The assailant's eyes widened in horror as he realized there was nothing to protect him. Much like the others, he too was flung out the entrance. That left the driver and potential hidden one. Issei narrowed his senses and tried to sense hostile intent throughout the area. Most of it was directed outside, though it had been greatly depleted by Issei. He could, however, feel a little something radiating within the building. His head swiveled down towards a man in the center of the huddled crowd, imposing as a hostage. When their eyes locked, his widened in horror and acceptance that Issei knew. He gripped a young man's shoulder and tried to pull a pistol out of the back of his pants hidden by his shirt. But two others had seen what he was attempting to do and so tried to stop him. The one behind him wrapped his arms around him in a headlock while the other pried the gun out of his hands. Issei activated his wings once more, flew over all their heads, and plucked the assailant out of the crowd. And rather than tossing him towards the police, Issei personally saw to it he was delivered, but not before being forcefully slammed to the ground hard enough to make him black out yet not enough to cause major damage. Before anything else, Issei flew up and arched over a few buildings with his senses tracing the final signature of similar intent coming from an alleyway a few blocks down. Disguised as a taxi van service, the escape vehicle as well as the driver was listening intently on a radio broadcast as well as a communicator in his hand. In panic, he started the vehicle and slammed the pedal to take off in all haste. Only for Issei to slam onto the hood hard enough to break the engine and the man to slam his head forward against the steering wheel. Had he not been wearing his seatbelt, then the damage would have been much more severe. Luckily Issei had noticed and chose this method rather than prying him out of the side door while the vehicle was still moving. But wanting to continue with this show, Issei lifted the van over his head and commanded his wings to take him back towards the scene. He heard the audible gasps of wonder as, like a superhero, he delivered the crushed van with the dazed driver to the center of the street. By the time he had gently released the van, the assailants were already in cuffs with some of them being checked by ambulance personnel, and the hostages were being escorted outside. Issei did not sense any other malintent coming from anywhere and so had to rule out the scene was taken care of. It was then the special task force arrived in their armored car. Men in tactical gear burst through the door with their weapons drawn and pointed at him. But he could feel both their fear and wonder radiating out of them. He could also feel their confusion for pointing a weapon at them, he who saved people and stopped criminals. But it was their duty and so thought nothing against them. But before taking off, with his back turned towards the crowds and several cameras pointed at him, he turned his body just enough for the left side of his helmed mask to appear. He then gave a thumbs up to them. Das ist für dich, Kirsch. He chose to speak in German to confuse everyone watching this. It's not like he could speak Japanese. People would speculate he was a Japanese citizen and would then start looking into him a little better. Someone clever would be able to narrow the search on his identity. So he chose German to throw a wrench in their search. Ayame was a smart girl and would be able to translate his words. No doubt everyone else in the whole world will as well. With that, his wings flared and he took off towards the skies, just slow enough for others to see his departure, but fast enough to appear with his trademark speed. They knew him as the Red Blur after all. Scene: Who the fuck is Sakura? Ayame asked the television as though it would provide the answer, as would, no doubt, countless others. By no means was Ayame shocked beyond understanding, because she was. Her hero of worship had just made an actual appearance and moved in motions for everyone to capture his every move. He could have appeared as a red phantom and taken out every burglar in the blink of an eye. But instead, he moved slowly enough for the cameras to record him. This had never been done before as the Red Blur had been nothing but an enigma to everyone. And then there was the departing words and gesture. That pose, the way he presented himself, the way she felt that ludicrously stupid smile behind that armor. The Red Blur was, without a doubt, Issei. There was also the error in her name. Kirsch meant cherry, which could also be translated to Sakura. As her name was Ayame, Issei was looking for Iris, which is still Iris in German. She wasn't sure if this was intentional to not have any links directed onto her once people began to look into it or from his lack of intelligence and researching skills. More than likely the answer was the latter. Still, Ayame had her eyes glued to the television for the rest of the day as she watched the news blow up in shock and wonder over this incident. Most of it was just recycled garbage as they replayed the incident over and over for the next several hours, and most likely for the next few days, like when his picture was captured by accident. But then, as the sun was about to set, Issei made another appearance in North America. The report was a few hours old but had finally made its way to Japan. He flew down and stopped a high-speed chase by picking up the escaping vehicle and flipping it onto its roof in an alleyway. He made sure the news chopper was keeping an eye on him. And then he gave the same pose in German before taking off. Later, it would be reported he had done the same thing with similar occurrences all over the world. Stopping break-ins and being captured by street cameras, raiding drug cartels and delivering the drug lords to government offices and, once again, posing for the security camera. And then there were the other small crimes, yet he took the time to stop and pose for the freaking camera. Some instances he was his usual high-speed self, only appearing as a red blur, solving the problem in less than an instant, and then making a new appearance on the opposite end of the world. There were so many questions Ayame had for him. But right now, her hero was on duty and she could wait for him to return. He should be returning in the evening to perform his devil duties, with the keyword being should. She could be patient and wait for him when the sun finally set. And late at night, when her anticipation spiked to where she was pacing around the room, she had enough and pulled out one of the many leaflets he let her have. She prayed to it as she normally would and waited for him to arrive. 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang. The idea that he had arrived so soon rather than taking the usual half an hour didn't cross her mind. She was far too excited to care. So when she opened the door, she didn't expect it to not be Issei. Good evening, little devil worshipper. First, previous ch3 of 1990.